It all begins in the lands of Mahidoro, 4 years after Emperor Cardion assumed the throne of the Eshreshar Empire, conquering the neighboring kingdoms that had rebelled. In the midst of this devastating war, a mercenary tried everything to survive while hiding his true past. But the memories of that turbulent period remained very much alive in Elric's mind. It all started the day the boy's father called him to deliver completely unexpected news, saying out of the blue that he would have to get married. The young man was completely speechless and asked what that meant, but his father coldly replied that his fiancée would be the daughter of Baron Wibben. He went on to explain that the girl was 16 years old, extremely beautiful, very calm, and whose only hobby was tending the garden. With little choice in the face of that imposition, Elric decided to leave the meeting room. And so it was, at just 14 years old, that the young man ended up being thrust into this sudden commitment. Elric simply couldn't believe he had just become engaged to a noblewoman he didn't even know or whose face he had ever seen. It started to dawn on him gradually, and he realized that the wedding was really going to happen anyway. On the day of the ceremony, as he gazed at the beautiful chapel, he was still trying to process everything his father had told him about that sudden agreement. At that moment, soft footsteps began to echo across the church's stone carpet. Elric clenched his hands anxiously, still wondering why a noblewoman from such an important family would agree to marry the son of simple merchants like himself. But all his doubts vanished when the bride approached and calmly said it was a great pleasure to meet him. Elric froze completely, blushing as he looked directly at the young woman for the first time. She formally introduced herself as Tyria Wibben, walking with an elegance that immediately impressed the young man. The boy was enchanted by her golden hair that shone like wheat, and by her green eyes that conveyed unparalleled sweetness. He noticed every detail, from her extremely fair and well-cared-for skin to the red lips that stood out on her face. For Elric, the only way to describe her would be as a mysterious young woman possessing an indescribable elegance. At that moment, a light touch on his shoulder brought him back to reality, with his father ordering him to finally present himself to his fiancée. Somewhat awkwardly and very embarrassed, he greeted her and said he hoped they would have a good life together from then on. Even with his mind completely confused and full of racing thoughts, a single certainty began to form in his chest at that moment. Now that they were officially married, Elric realized he would spend the rest of his days with that incredible girl. Looking back after so much time, he finally understood that that pure feeling was his first love. He tried everything to hide the silly, happy smile that kept appearing on his face while the two exchanged rings at the altar. Elric even put on a slightly more serious face to hide his nervousness and avoid grinning like a fool in front of all the guests. But in that moment of pure joy, the young man was completely oblivious to the reality of the facts. He didn't even suspect that the whole situation he had imposed could be deeply hurting Tyria's feelings. Some time after the wedding, on a night of heavy storm and thunder echoing through the Portman mansion, things began to change. Inside the silent room, only a solitary candle illuminated Elric's pensive atmosphere. The young man fidgeted restlessly with his wedding ring, still reflecting on how that engagement had happened so suddenly. He smiled slightly as he remembered that such an elegant and refined woman was now officially his wife. However, the image of her father deciding on that marriage without giving further explanations began to haunt her thoughts again. Although he was immensely happy with the union, a nagging feeling wouldn't leave him alone. His smile quickly faded when he realized that none of it made logical sense. Elric then decided to question the housemaid about the real reason why a noblewoman would agree to marry the heir of mere merchants. Rhonda became visibly uncomfortable with the direct question and began to hesitate, unsure of what to say to her boss. The young man insisted and pleaded with Rhonda to tell him the truth immediately, as he was certain she knew everything that had happened behind the scenes of that deal. The governess hesitated for a few more moments, swallowing hard at the young master's determined and worried gaze, until she finally opened up and revealed that it was all just an arranged marriage for purely commercial reasons. She explained that, despite their glorious and wealthy past, Baron Wibben's family was mired in enormous debt and on the verge of bankruptcy, and that Elric's father had used this weakness to his advantage. The agreement for the union to take place was simple. Elric's father would pay all the nobles' debts in exchange for the marriage between the two. Rhonda concluded by saying that, thanks to this business partnership, the Portman family would finally be able to rise in social status and be elevated to nobility. Horrified by the revelation, Elric asked in shock if this meant that Tyria had practically been sold to them. He refused to believe that the woman he loved so much had gone through such humiliation just because of money. A terrible feeling of guilt consumed the young man as he realized the ridiculous and cruel role his own family had played in this whole story. Unable to stand still for another second, Elric slammed the bedroom door open and ran out in desperation. He ran aimlessly through the mansion's corridors, wanting only to find his wife and try to explain himself. Her only wish in that moment of agony was to sincerely apologize for all the silent suffering she must have endured because of them. Desperate, and with a heavy heart, Elric tried to think of any plausible justification to comfort Tyria's heart, even knowing that nothing could erase what had been done. Elric keeps running until he's exhausted, bracing his hand against the wall as he tries everything to catch his breath. He feels utterly exhausted and powerless due to the overwhelming despair consuming his chest. The boy is breathing with great difficulty, trying somehow to process all the pain of that terrible revelation. Finally, he arrives at the large doors of Tyria's room and hesitates for a brief moment before turning the doorknob. As Elric placed his hand on the wood, he heard a muffled murmur coming from inside and decided to peek carefully. He opens a small crack in the door and clearly hears the sound of his wife's sobs and stifled crying. To her dismay, Tyria is crying profusely, tears streaming down her flushed face. She is curled up on the edge of the bed, hugging her knees in a moment of pure loneliness and profound sadness. Seeing that heartbreaking scene through the crack in the door, Elric's heart completely shattered. The moment he sees the young woman's suffering, he slowly backs away, feeling unable to face her in that state. It is right there that the boy makes a drastic decision and vows to himself that he will do everything to annul that unjust marriage. Without wasting any time, Elric's father continues writing his official documents in his office. The man works quietly in the dim light of the room, believing that his ambitious plans are going perfectly well. But the silence of the office is broken when Elric bursts through the doors and desperately shouts for his father. He enters the room determinedly, demanding immediately that the wedding be cancelled once and for all. Elric rages that he has discovered the whole truth and questions his father about whether Tyria was only sold to save her family from financial ruin. Desperate and not knowing what else to do, the boy begs with tears in his eyes for his father to undo that cursed agreement. However, the man remains incredibly calm in the face of his son's outburst, and only pronounces Elric's name in a cold and authoritative tone. With a menacing and penetrating gaze, the father curtly orders the boy to stop acting like a spoiled child. He makes a point of reminding them that they are now true nobles, and that Elric needs to start behaving like one from now on. That cold, merciless look from his own father sends a chill down the boy's spine instantly. This causes Elric to clench his fists tightly and remember the harsh and sad reality he has always lived within that mansion. He was always seen only as the cursed child who took his own mother's life on the very day he was born. Elric knows very well that he has always been the target of his father's resentment and nothing more than a puppet used to ensure the financial prosperity of the Portman family. To his own father, he would never be anything more than a disposable business tool. Knowing that this was the only use they saw for him, a flame of rebellion begins to ignite in the young man's mind. Faced with this situation, Elric decides that the only logical way to rid himself of this burden is simply to disappear from there forever. He wants to do this both to free the girl who was sold for gold coins and to completely ruin his father's ambitious plans. Determined to change his destiny with his own hands, the young man gathers his few belongings and prepares to abandon the Portman name forever. Beneath a relentless storm battering the region's wheat fields, Elric begins his silent escape into the dark night. Carrying only a backpack and a simple sword at his waist, he heads towards the unknown in the heavy rain. Even far from home, the young man can't get Tyria out of his head. wondering if she was crying because she had been sold or because of the pain of abandoning her old life. Or worse, he wonders if all that painful crying was simply out of pure hatred at having to marry someone like him. These cruel doubts continue to hammer in Elric's mind as the cold rain falls relentlessly on his tired face. But he tries to push those thoughts away, repeating to himself that it doesn't matter anymore, because he's already made his decision and is leaving anyway. The arduous journey leads him to a massive stone fortress that serves as a base for warriors and mercenaries in the region. Upon arriving there amidst the storm, a veteran and very muscular warrior notices the boy's presence and rudely asks who is there. The man assesses the young man from head to toe before asking if a youth who looks so frail really wants to become a true mercenary. With a firm and determined look, Elric replies without hesitation that yes, he is ready to fight. He formally introduces himself, adopting a new identity, and says that from now on his fighting name will be Kasha. Kasha completely abandoned the past and spent the next 10 years fighting fiercely on bloody battlefields to ensure his survival. Throughout that cruel time, he transformed into a feared legend known as the Demon of the Sword, keeping Elric's name buried in the past as his greatest secret. Kasha gazes at the crimson horizon of the battlefield, enveloped in a heavy silence after the end of yet another intense battle. He now wears an imposing suit of metal armor, showing how much he has matured and become strong in all these years of trial. However, his expression remains cold and very distant, marked by the invisible scars of so many losses in the war. Just ahead, new lines of soldiers equipped with shields and firearms begin to position themselves for yet another confrontation. Alone before that entire enemy military contingent, the warrior stands firmly with his enormous sword in hand. Kasha grips his weapon tightly and charges at his opponents without showing the slightest sign of hesitation or fear. With a devastating and incredibly fast strike, he cuts through the air and tears a path through the enemy's first lines of defense. Even with his face splattered with the blood of his adversaries, the legendary warrior maintains absolute calm, focused solely on surviving yet another terrible battle. Meanwhile, inside a busy local tavern, people chatted quietly at their tables. The bar owner continues cleaning his wooden glasses until he hears the sound of slow footsteps approaching the entrance. He immediately breaks into a friendly smile and welcomes the new customer who has just entered, leaning on a cane. This is Elric, now older and dressed in very elegant clothes, walking with visible difficulty in his left leg. Almost everyone in the establishment suddenly falls silent and begins to watch the man limp silently across the room. Some customers begin to whisper, recognizing the newcomer as the famous sword demon and wondering why he returned from the battlefield. Others notice his shuffling gait and comment in surprise on the possibility that he was seriously injured during the war. Elric finally settles at the counter, and the tavern keeper, concerned about the boy's condition, asks what happened to make him limp like that. The young man explains simply that it was just a painful souvenir he brought back from his last battle, and accepts the local newspaper that the man hands him amicably. While the tavern keeper asks if the injury is very serious, Elric flips through the pages, commenting that he will have to live with this physical limitation for quite some time. But then, suddenly, his hand grips the paper with extreme force as he reads a completely shocking news story on the newspaper page. The tavern owner notices the sudden change in the young man's behavior and asks, worried, if something is wrong. Elric doesn't respond immediately, his eyes red with pure hatred and shock as he stares blankly at the news. It turns out that the newspaper page featured an obituary with Hovan Portman's photo, revealing recent and shocking events about his own family. A short time later, the loud sound of locomotive smoke cuts through the silence of that sunny afternoon. The vehicle travels at high speed along the rustic tracks under the beautiful orange sky of the late afternoon. Inside one of the passenger cars, Elric travels thoughtfully while watching the landscape rush by the window. He still can't believe that the face of the father he so resented in life was so discreetly printed in the corner of a regular newspaper. His father, Hovan Portman, had finally passed away, leaving behind a trail of business secrets and unresolved grievances. Elric remembers that when he first ran away from home during a storm, he still held on to a tiny glimmer of hope that his father would come looking for him. At the time, at only 14 years old, that was just a very childish and naive feeling on his part. But even thinking about it now, after going through so many wars, he feels that his childhood hope wasn't entirely without merit. Ultimately, even though he was treated merely as a useless tool for family pride and blamed for his own mother's tragic death, the blood tie still existed. Ultimately, Elric was still his son, and in some dark corner of his wounded heart, he only longed for a little paternal affection. He wallows in these thoughts in the solitude of the train car, realizing how foolish he was to want the affection of such a cold and calculating man. It had all been nothing but a grand illusion, and now that his father was dead, the very object of all his resentment had vanished from this world. He feels that only a cowardly version of himself remains, using his father's death as a mere acceptable excuse to finally return home. The train suddenly begins to brake with a screeching noise on the tracks, bringing to the surface the frozen regret from 10 years ago as it approached its old city. The station's loudspeaker announces their arrival at their final destination, and Elric disembarks onto the Wibbin platform, ready to face the consequences of his past. Before his eyes, the golden wheat fields gleam intensely under the soft light of the peaceful sunset in that region. Elric takes a deep breath, contemplating the familiar view he hasn't seen in a whole decade since the day of his escape. He realizes with surprise that, despite 10 years having passed, absolutely nothing has changed in that bucolic and peaceful place. The quiet, peaceful streets remained exactly as they were, tinged with the vibrant red of the autumn leaves falling from the trees. Seeing the locals strolling leisurely creates a strange feeling in him, mixing deep nostalgia with a strong sense of no longer belonging to that routine. The tranquility of the children running and playing freely contrasts sharply with the sharp, violent tension of the battlefields he has just left behind. He continues his way slowly along the dirt road, leaning firmly on his cane with each difficult step. As he felt the gentle autumn breeze on his face, a slight smile of peace appeared on his lips for the first time after so many years of war. Elric gazes at the vast golden expanse of the wheat field that is the great symbol of the entire famous Wibbin estate. He fondly remembers running happily around there, playing hide-and-seek with the other children of the village without a care in the world. He also remembers the amusing scoldings he received from the maids whenever he returned to the mansion with his clothes filthy with dirt. As he travels down the road, each of these childhood memories resurfaces vividly in his mind. The young man thoughtfully reflects on the power of those comforting memories that he tried for so long to erase on the battlefield. But suddenly, he stops abruptly in his tracks when he sees something. Elric's gaze becomes extremely serious and focused on a specific point just ahead of the wheat field. The image of Tyria in her beautiful wedding dress comes to mind, making him fondly wonder if the young lady has managed to live well all this time. With a resigned smile, he thinks that a woman so beautiful must surely have found a good suitor and remarried in the meantime. Elric reaches out and gently strokes the golden ears of wheat, trying to convince himself that this was the best fate for her. But his eyes widened in utter shock when a female voice shouted Tyria's name from very close by. Elric turns quickly and spots a young woman in a straw hat carrying a sheaf of wheat, while a maid runs anxiously towards her to help with the weight of the harvest. The maid reaches out to pick up Tyria's heavy load, completely oblivious to the fact that the former young master is watching them in shock from afar. Elric's heart races as he wonders if the beautiful woman before him is indeed his former fiancée. The young noblewoman thanks her servant for her help and continues walking elegantly through the field, while the maid follows closely behind. When she finally looks up and sees Elric standing in the middle of the road, surprise immediately takes over her face. The two stand still in the middle of the golden field, staring intently at each other under the soft reddish light of the sunset. With a very melancholic expression, Tyria breaks the silence and asks directly why he decided to return home after so long. Elric tries everything to find the right words to explain himself, but shame and nervousness prevent him from speaking immediately. She then reminds him firmly, but very calmly, that despite the long 10-year abandonment, she is still his lawful wife. Hearing that cold statement makes Elric feel like the biggest fool in the world for his selfish past actions. He realizes how naive he was to believe in the past that the marriage would simply be annulled by law if he disappeared without a trace. After all, if that arranged marriage could be undone so easily, she would never have been sold to the Portman family to save her parents. The young man is tormented by the thought that his impulsive childhood escape ended up robbing Tyria of even the last vestige of freedom she could have had in life. She remains standing there before him, holding the sheaf of harvested wheat with a sorrowful look that cuts deeply into Elric's soul. He realizes he has failed miserably, for he was unable to protect his own pride, much less spare the woman he married from suffering great humiliation. Ultimately, faced with so much sadness, Elric sees himself only as a cowardly, weak, and extremely selfish man. While he spent his last years wielding his sword and fighting for his own survival on the battlefields, Tyria suffered alone in the mansion. The boy imagines how difficult, lonely, and painful it must have been for her to go through all that social rejection, completely abandoned by everyone. He knows very well that he needs to apologize to her immediately, but a cruel doubt begins to creep into his weary mind. Elric wonders if he even has the right to ask for forgiveness after 10 years, or if she would simply reject any apology from him at this point. Slightly stuttering and very embarrassed in her presence, he finally tries to start a conversation in a very awkward way, but Tyria merely observes him in absolute silence, maintaining a calm and expressionless gaze that only makes him more tense. Instead of responding to his hesitation, she very practically suggests that they go inside the house so they can talk more calmly. She turns and begins to walk slowly towards the mansion, with Elric following close behind at a slow pace, aided by his cane. The young man feels extremely bothered by her lack of reaction, growing increasingly nervous with each step they take. Deep down, he wished she were furious or would yell at him because her silence was far more painful to bear than any rage. A chilling image flashes through Elric's mind, leading him to imagine that Tyria might harbor a terrible resentment for having been left behind for so long. He bitterly questions what he truly hopes to achieve by returning to Wibben after so many years of complete absence. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps coming from behind makes the boy stop abruptly in the middle of the dirt road. Elric's eyes widen as he notices who is running towards the main house. It is the housekeeper Rhonda, who comes running hurriedly down the path upon spotting the two on the horizon. Seeing that he had suddenly stopped walking, Tyria turned around, confused, and asked if he wasn't going to accompany her inside the house. But Elric remains completely still in the same place, his gaze fixed on the person approaching him. He takes a deep breath, grips the handle of his cane firmly, and replies that he's coming, trying his best to hide his agitation. Upon arriving at the imposing mansion, Tyria politely says she will call the butler and asks Elric to wait there in the garden for a moment. She observes him for a brief, mysterious moment before retreating inside the property. Tyria opens the large glass doors and enters the mansion very naturally, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Elric remains in the courtyard, meticulously observing the facade of the enormous building he once called home. To his complete surprise, everything there remains exactly the same as the day he decided to run away from home to become a wandering mercenary. Every little detail of the courtyard, including the beautiful disused water fountain in the center, remains intact as if time had stood still. From the number of windows to the smallest stain on the stone columns, everything brings back old memories with painful clarity. An ironic smile appears on Elric's face as he realizes how his family's mansion remains absolutely identical to the past. But his train of thought is interrupted when a firm female voice asks from behind him who he is and what he's doing there at this hour. Elric turns slowly upon hearing the call, already knowing very well whose familiar voice it is. It is the housekeeper, Rhonda, who walks towards him in a stern manner and asks who he has come to visit at the Wibben mansion. Elric can't contain his emotion at the reunion and says Rhonda's name aloud, leaving the woman intrigued. The young man says softly that Rhonda hasn't changed at all in appearance, even after a whole decade away. With a slight, nostalgic smile on his face, He asks if she really doesn't recognize her former young master. Rhonda stares at him confused for a few seconds, adjusting her glasses to better see the visitor's striking features. Suddenly, understanding dawns on the governess, and her eyes widen in utter thrilling shock. She stammers, completely paralyzed, as she realizes that the mature man standing right there in front of her is the heir everyone believed they had lost forever. Ignoring the formalities of her position, Rhonda runs towards him and grabs his arms, tears welling in her eyes, asking if it is truly young Master Elric who has returned home. Elric hugs the old housekeeper very affectionately and says softly that he is finally back home after so long away. Rhonda sheds tears of pure happiness upon confirming that the young man standing before her is indeed her beloved young master, whom she has missed so much. She comments, emotionally, that he has changed so much and grown in such an impressive way that it was almost impossible to recognize him at first glance. With a gentle smile, he agrees that he has changed quite a bit, and that it would be perfectly normal for her not to immediately remember his old features. But suddenly, his gaze becomes a little more serious as he remembers a very intriguing detail about his reunion with Tyria minutes ago. He returns to thinking about his wife's impactful statement, affirming with such conviction that she was still his legitimate partner. Elric knows very well that he has spent the last 10 years fighting on the battlefield as a complete stranger under a new identity. Noticing his sudden silence and focused expression, Rhonda asks worriedly if something is wrong with the young man. The young man reflects to himself that he has changed so much physically that even Rhonda, who cared for him like a mother, had extreme difficulty recognizing him at first. Then, a great doubt begins to torment his mind as to how Tyria managed to identify him so quickly and without any hesitation. Elric desperately tries to unravel the mystery while preparing to take a relaxing bath in the mansion. He keeps wondering how she could be absolutely certain of who he was with just a single brief glance in the wheat field. Meanwhile, the wind blows gently through the large open curtains of the imposing mansion's bathroom. Tyria silently observes the sunset landscape through the window pane, seemingly immersed in her own nostalgic thoughts. From afar, she sees the exact moment when Elric and Rhonda were having a warm conversation in the main courtyard garden. The image of Elric's blushing face upon seeing her for the first time in the wheat field was still very fresh in the young noblewoman's memory. She sighs deeply and gently places her hand on her chest, feeling her own heart beat differently after so many years of solitude. A slight blush appears on her cheeks as she tries to calm her confused feelings at her husband's return. The truth is, she perfectly remembered that striking scar on the back of his neck when she saw him from behind. Besides immediately recognizing the same shade of brown hair he'd always had since he was just a helpless boy. For her, in the end, absolutely nothing of importance had changed in the essence of that man. A little later, Elric relaxes deeply in a bathtub filled with hot water inside the luxurious guest bathroom. The persistent question of how his wife first identified him continues to hammer incessantly in his tired head. He lifts his injured leg out of the warm water, thoughtfully observing the battle scar that now causes him to limp every day. After finishing his long bath, Elric puts on a comfortable white bathrobe and calmly ties his belt around his waist. But he is completely taken by surprise when he hears an unexpected noise coming from the entrance of the room. To his complete astonishment, Tyria had also just entered the room to take her bath, unaware that he was still using the space. She turns completely red with embarrassment when she comes face to face with her husband in such an intimate and unexpected situation. Desperate about the situation, the young woman begins to apologize, stammering badly, and tries to quickly cover herself with a towel. Seeing the girl's obvious panic, who is almost crying from embarrassment, Elric tries to calm her down as quickly as possible. He begs her not to cry, and gestures awkwardly to show that it was all just a terrible misunderstanding about schedules. Tyria looks at him with teary eyes and flushed cheeks, still extremely embarrassed by the whole mess they've made. It is at that exact moment that a young maid enters the bathroom with a basket of clothes and lets out a deafening scream of pure fright. She throws everything up in the air in a panic and runs desperately through the mansion's corridors, screaming for help. The housekeeper Marie appears running in shortly afterwards, shouting and very frightened, asking what is happening inside. And the shocking scene she witnesses is of Elric holding his wife in a rather compromising position in the middle of the damp bathroom. The boy is completely speechless, paralyzed with embarrassment as he awkwardly tries to hold Tyria so she doesn't fall. Tyria, crying from embarrassment at being caught, quietly calls out to the housekeeper to try and explain the awkward situation. Sweating profusely, Elric tries to disguise his nervousness with a forced smile and awkwardly explains that his wife was about to slip and he simply caught her in time. While this great commotion unfolds at the mansion, the story takes us back to the tense defensive line on the Chevor border. The local guards maintain a high vigil in the trenches, closely watching for any sign of advancing enemy forces. But the calm is broken when LeBron appears, the feared knight of the vanguard who leads the elite team of the invading Imperial army. The defending soldiers advance, running and shouting desperate orders to try and eliminate the Imperial vanguard at all costs. With a sadistic grin on his face, LeBron challenges his opponents and vows to cut them all in half without mercy. He unleashes a veritable massacre on the battlefield, delivering lethal blows that fell several men in seconds. The surviving guards are thrown into utter panic when they realize they don't stand a chance of defeating that monstrous warrior. The commander shouts desperately for all units to retreat immediately and flee behind the main security line. Amidst the frantic chaos of soldiers fleeing in desperation, a lone mercenary calmly walks in the opposite direction, sword in hand. The Imperial soldiers stop in surprise and wonder who that madman is, believing him to be just another weak mercenary hired by Chevor. But that mysterious man was none other than Kasha, who coldly raises his blade and positions himself to begin combat against the elite troop. With a relentless gaze, the sword demon focuses entirely on the colossal threat approaching. LeBron speeds across the muddy field, delivering a brutal blow toward the mercenary. But Kasha dodges the attack with extreme agility at the last second and blocks the impact with his own blade. He positions himself firmly and calmly, perfectly analyzing every opening in his opponent's disorganized movements. In a swift and deadly counterattack, the mercenary delivers a precise blow that severely wounds the Imperial commander. LeBron falls to his knees on the hard-packed floor in pain, completely defeated and too weak to continue lifting his weapon. Without showing any hesitation or mercy, Kasha finishes the fight with a quick and decisive cut. The Imperial leader's helmet rolls lifelessly through the mud, under the utter panic of his own allied troops. The Imperial infantry soldiers are completely paralyzed with fear in the face of the absurd force demonstrated by the enemy. Kasha formally introduces himself as a mercenary knight hired by Chevor while coldly observing his defeated opponent. He challenges all remaining enemy soldiers, vowing to annihilate anyone who dares to take another step against him. Suddenly, his heightened survival instinct alerts him that a surprise attack is coming from a distance. Kasha quickly activates her powerful mana shield to try and block the imminent impact of the mysterious projectile. But the enemy shot manages to shatter his defensive barrier and hits his left leg squarely with a deafening sound. The force of the shot causes him to fall to his knees on the ground, with a lot of blood gushing from the serious and deep wound in his knee. Gritting his teeth in pure agony, he struggles to remain composed as he furiously confronts the source of that treacherous attack. Looking up at the top of a nearby rocky cliff, he spots two dark and mysterious silhouettes observing all the carnage. They were dangerous masked snipers, equipped with modern, highly accurate firearms. At that moment, Elric wakes up startled and sweating in his chambers, realizing that it was all just another nightmare about his traumatic past in the war. He sits on the bed with a combat dagger firmly gripped in his trembling hands, breathing heavily. His eyes still gleam with the fury of that bad memory as he tries everything to calm his racing heart. Looking at the gleaming blade in his hands and his own scratched arms, the adrenaline of battle slowly begins to subside in Elric's chest. He observes the luxurious and silent room, now fully illuminated by the soft morning light streaming through the large windows of the Portman mansion. The boy finally remembers that he is now in a safe place, and that he has indeed returned to the tranquility of his old home. But his thoughts are suddenly interrupted by the unexpected sound of light knocking on his door. The housekeeper asks from outside if he is already awake, causing Elric to quickly hide the dagger he was holding under the sheets. He hesitates for a brief moment before answering, trying to force a firm, natural voice after the shock of the nightmare. In a much calmer tone, the boy replies simply that he is already awake. Elric gives a slight, friendly smile as he concludes that he has just woken up from his morning nap. Rhonda then enters the spacious room, carrying a wooden basin full of fresh water for the boy to wash himself. She promptly fulfills the young master's request for cold water and places the container at his disposal so that he can start his day well. Upon donning the new fine clothes provided by the servants, Elric is impressed by the extreme softness of the luxurious silk fabric. He leans firmly on his cane and stares at his reflection in the bedroom mirror, thinking that all this comfort is an undeserved luxury for a former mercenary. The young man tries to force a friendly smile at himself in front of the mirror, but the expression comes out rather awkward and unnatural. Limping as he walks makes him realize that so many years on the battlefield have hardened his face to the point that he has almost forgotten how to truly smile. Rhonda opens the doors to the room and compliments his elegant appearance, affectionately suggesting they start the morning with a hearty breakfast. The housekeeper positions herself impeccably in the hallway of the house, conveying to the young man the security and familial affection he so desperately needed. As they walk down the hallway, she carefully asks how his leg ended up in that deplorable state, and Elric lies, saying he simply slipped on a steep hill. He would never have the courage to confess that an enemy bullet had pierced his knee in combat, for he did not want to cause unnecessary worry to those who cared about him. Rhonda chuckled softly and joked that, just like the previous day with the embarrassing bathroom incident, he remained very prone to getting into minor accidents. At that moment, the large doors of the dining room slowly opened before the pair of walkers. Elric immediately spotted his beautiful wife, who was already patiently waiting for him, seated at the breakfast table. Tyria turns around very gently and asks in a soft voice if he managed to sleep well that night at the mansion. The embarrassing image of her wrapped in a towel after her shower the previous day comes rushing back into the young man's mind in the same second. The boy turns completely red with embarrassment as he tries to stammer a minimally polite response to her. But the young maid Marie shatters the romantic mood between the couple by pointing her finger at him and shouting at the top of her lungs that he is a shameless pervert. Rhonda immediately gives Marie a corrective smack on the head, angrily ordering her to stop spouting outrageous nonsense about the young master spying on his mistress. While the housekeeper drags the chatty maid out of the dining room, Tyria simply wishes her husband a pleasant stay at home. Sensing the tense atmosphere and his face burning with embarrassment, Elric feigns a slight cough to clear his throat and break the ice. He finally gives a genuine smile and replies that he had a great night's sleep, thanking her sincerely for her concern and kindness. Intrigued by the situation from a few minutes ago, Elric asks the name of the new maid, and Tyria calmly explains that Marie is just a newly hired employee. Seeing her husband's obvious embarrassment, Tyria understandingly says that he shouldn't worry so much about Marie's exaggerated insults. He quickly gestures with his hands to dismiss the matter, insisting that everything is fine and that she doesn't need to worry about it. Elric carefully rests his cane beside the dining table to begin eating before the food gets cold. He adds, a little awkwardly and blushing, that he asked the question purely out of curiosity, having never seen Marie's face at the mansion before. Tyria stared intently at him with her beautiful golden eyes and replied in a calm tone, simply accepting his explanation. Absolute silence then reigns in the room as the two savor their morning meal, accompanied only by the clinking of cutlery against the dishes. Tyria eats in an extremely graceful manner and seems quite pleased with the taste of the meal. Suddenly, the young noblewoman looks up, quite surprised, when Elric decides to broach a delicate subject. He takes a deep breath and says seriously that he needs to formally apologize for the embarrassing misunderstanding in the bathroom the previous day. Tyria's cheeks immediately flushed a deep red when she realized the boy was talking about that very intimate moment of nudity. Before her husband can even finish his apology, she quickly interrupts him, shyly saying that everything is all right. Tyria sweetly insists that he simply enjoy his breakfast, and Elric silently decides to accept her suggestion. But deep down, the young noblewoman remains immensely ashamed by that sudden and striking memory. She looks away thoughtfully, lost in her own silent conclusions about the mysterious man who has returned to her life. Elric awkwardly fiddles with the back of his neck, trying to ease the tension of the moment, unsure of how to react. Her mind, however, had focused on another very impactful detail of that accidental reunion in the bathroom. Tyria couldn't stop thinking about the numerous deep scars covering her husband's chest, silently wondering what kind of dangerous life he had led to survive with so many brutal marks. Meanwhile, the two continued to feign normalcy at the dining table, illuminated by the morning sunlight. Elric bitterly regretted bringing up such a sensitive subject at breakfast, feeling that the awkward silence would drive him mad in no time. To disguise the tense atmosphere between the two, they begin to eat the rest of their meals rather hurriedly. Elric gorges himself on food all at once and almost chokes from nervousness, quickly wiping his mouth with a napkin under Tyria's worried gaze. He gets up hurriedly with his mouth still full, gives a thumbs up, and says he needs to leave so she can finish eating in peace. Elric finally leaves the dining room and closes the large wooden door behind him with a sigh of relief. Tyria sighs softly, still somewhat disoriented by her husband's abrupt and awkward departure. She flashes a very sweet, blushing smile, silently wishing him a very pleasant day on the property. As Elric walks through the mansion after his meal, he notices that the entire staff is working at full speed to clean and organize the large rooms. Under Rhonda's loving guidance, the young master greets each of the house's employees, being received by all with immense respect and open arms. However, some servants begin to whisper jokingly, congratulating the young man on his supposed bold advances towards his wife the previous day. But Marie remains firm in her sullen stance, repeating in a tone of silent protest that he is nothing but a big pervert. She yells at her co-workers in the middle of the hall, demanding that they all stop turning a blind eye to Elric's shameless behavior. Before Marie can continue her outburst about the young man's return, the elderly butler of the house places a firm hand on her shoulder and calls her over authoritatively. The man smiles amicably and asks the young woman to show more respect for the heir, saying that she is still too young to understand the mysteries of married life. He calmly explains to the young woman that the primary duty of any noble couple is simply to ensure a legitimate heir for the continuation of the family line. The old butler continues to proudly defend the idea that Elric merely proved himself to be an exemplary nobleman by seeking out his wife in the bathroom to fulfill his duties immediately upon returning. Marie rants that it was just pure perverse instinct on his part, while the other noble servants continue praising and cheering Elric's firm attitude backstage. The butler congratulates the young man on his demonstrated determination and asks hopefully if this return means he has finally come to stay in Wibben for good. Elric gripped the handle of his cane tightly, for in reality he still had no idea what his next move in that city would be. Although he knows his serious knee injury will force him to stay there to recover for a while, he wonders if he could truly act as the master of that immense estate after spending so many years fighting in the war. To escape that awkward conversation with the servants, Elric gets up, saying he needs to step out quickly, and the butler agrees, stating that the important thing at the moment is to have him back. The young man then asks the faithful butler Aldio to prepare a carriage immediately for his morning departure. Shortly afterwards, the carriage sets off at a steady speed along the roads bordered by the beautiful golden wheat fields of the estate. From the mansion's courtyard, Tyria silently watches the vehicle speed away down the road. She grips the brim of her straw hat tightly as the wind blows strongly, ruffling her beautiful golden hair under the blue sky. The carriage continues its solitary and silent journey, cutting through the beautiful autumnal landscape of the Wibben lands. The vehicle finally stops at the top of a silent wooded hill, and Elric gets out to walk slowly to a grave he spots there. He gazes at the stone tombstone with an extremely melancholic expression and whispers softly that it has indeed been a very long time since they last spoke. Before the boy lies the grave of his late father, Hoven Portman, bathed in golden sunlight and surrounded by autumn leaves. Elric confesses to himself that he has always harbored immense and deep resentment towards the man who raised him merely as a cold business tool. But he concludes with deep regret that despite all the hatred he felt for his father, he never wanted their final reunion to happen in such a sad way. Hovin Portman was a pioneer who transformed the Portman family from mere merchants into the most powerful guild in Wibben, but his ruthless coldness also earned him numerous enemies throughout his career. Elric wonders if that stern man ever offered him a genuine smile or uttered a single kind word in his entire life as a father. Staring at the cold tombstone, the boy murmurs that if his father intended to play the role of cruel villain to the end, he should at least have lived a little longer to see his return. The autumnal wind stirs the dry leaves around Elric as he stands in absolute silence before his family's grave. He whispers to the tombstone that he no longer feels that overwhelming resentment he used to carry in his heart throughout his youth. The young man finally decides to look away from the grave and calls for the Portman family's loyal butler. Walking back to the carriage, Elric asks about the cause of his father's death, and Aldio replies sadly that his former master suffered from a serious heart condition. He becomes quite thoughtful upon hearing that his father hid his physical weakness from everyone until the end, allowing only his personal physician and butler to know of his illness. Aldio reveals that, realizing his final days were approaching, Hovin Portman focused all his remaining efforts on closing his old businesses and liquidating most of his assets. Elric finds Aldio's dedication amusing and curiously asks what he sees as so praiseworthy in a man so cold as to serve him with such loyalty for so many years. With a calm, ironic smile on his face, the old butler replied in a very practical way that he did everything for money, and that there would be no other logical reason. But Aldio quickly changes the tone of the conversation and observes, intrigued, that the young master still hasn't asked the question that really matters about the current financial situation. He refers to the family's large inheritance, explaining in detail that the deceased boss converted as many assets as possible into cash before his final departure. Elric simply listens intently, maintaining a serious and neutral expression at the mention of such wealth. The elderly butler then formally reveals that all that immense fortune, liquidated, was left as an inheritance exclusively to the young master Elric. Shortly after the conversation, the carriage resumes its journey back along the charming tree-lined road of the town of Wibben. From inside the vehicle, Elric thoughtfully asks if his father really didn't leave any official will with his last personal words for him. Aldio agrees that his late boss wasn't the type to leave sentimental words written down, leaving only strictly written instructions about the inheritance that he can show later. The boy gripped the handle of his cane tightly, still trying to decipher the true intentions that motivated his strict father to act in such a way before passing away. According to Elric, Hovin Portman handled the final moments of his life in an even colder and more calculating manner than usual, focusing solely on his inheritance. The butler wisely advises him to take all the time he needs to calmly reflect on the fate of that large inheritance left behind. Elric gazes thoughtfully out the window, focused on another great, intriguing question that has begun to deeply trouble him. The thought of his beautiful wife Tyria once again completely occupies his mind as the return journey continues through the countryside. He wonders why she still lives in that empty mansion, since, with her escape 10 years ago, the marriage should have been legally annulled. Ultimately, that forced union between the two was nothing more than a cold, politically and financially orchestrated deal by Hovin Portman. The young man tries to understand if this fact explains her staying in the house, while Aldio remembers another very important detail he forgot to mention earlier. The butler reveals that the Portman family now officially holds the hereditary barony title, and that, as soon as he inherits it, Elric will become the new baron. He makes a point of clearly emphasizing that all the net worth and the noble title belongs solely to Elric, and not to his mistress. The carriage finally arrives at the main courtyard of the beautiful mansion, concluding its journey from the cemetery under the pleasant afternoon sun. As he exits the vehicle, Elric reflects that if Tyria's true interest were only the Portman family's money, she would have no reason to continue living there after the Baron's death. Aldio confirms the young man's suspicions, explaining that the girl could have claimed the inheritance as a legal representative and left a long time ago, but chose of her own accord to remain in the mansion. Surprised and quite intrigued by the revelation, the young master immediately questions whether the butler knows the real reason behind Tyria's persistent choice. Aldio shakes his head melancholically and sincerely admits that she is an extremely reserved woman, and that the two of them never had the intimacy for such a revelation. The young woman always possessed a noble and aloof aura that prevented any of her servants from approaching her, making it impossible for the butler to question her true intentions. Elric remarks that she does indeed seem to be quite a complex person to deal with, but the butler is quick to remind him firmly that this mysterious woman is still his rightful wife. The old butler gives the carriage horse a loving pat and concludes with a wise smile that practically every marriage arranged by nobles begins in this same distant way. Elric bids farewell to the employee and begins to climb the steps to the mansion's entrance, carefully leaning on his cane for support. Upon reaching the main gate, he encounters Tyria again, who is carefully holding a small bag of harvested grain. The girl looked away, blushing slightly, upon noticing her husband's sudden presence in the courtyard. She nervously presses her hands against her dress, revealing the sparkling wedding ring on her ring finger. With very soft and elegant steps, she walks gracefully towards the entrance hall of the mansion. Elric breaks the ice gently and asks softly if she has just returned from her work in the fields. Tyria stood before him and, visibly embarrassed, asked when he had arrived from his carriage ride to the hill. She explains in a calm tone that she was simply returning from her daily work walk through the beautiful wheat fields of the property. The young man feels his face burn slightly as he contemplates the sweetness and indescribable beauty of his wife under the sunlight. He then gently suggests that the two of them enter the residence together, and Tyria readily agrees to her husband's proposal. The couple ascends the imposing marble staircase of the mansion's main hall to the rhythmic sound of their footsteps. As they walk side by side, Elric desperately tries to think of some light topic to talk about, mentally cursing his own lack of social skills in casual conversation. He glances at her sideways with admiration, noting that, even dressed in simple country clothes, she still carries a very striking, noble, and imposing aura. An old curiosity resurfaces in his heart, making him wonder if Tyria already possessed that same majestic presence 10 years ago, when they were first married in church. Elric perfectly remembers how his fiancée's face was intensely flushed with embarrassment beneath her veil on their wedding day. But his thoughts are suddenly interrupted when he accidentally bumps his injured leg against the marble step with too much force. The sudden impact causes him to lose his balance on the stairs, startling Tyria, who anxiously asks if he is all right. Elric manages to quickly plant the tip of his cane on the stone floor, narrowly avoiding a nasty fall. He gives an awkward smile and makes up the excuse that his legs just gave out a little from the day's fatigue, cursing inwardly that she was witnessing his physical weakness. Continuing the climb at a slow pace, the young man politely apologizes for not being able to help her carry the heavy sack of grain due to his physical limitations. When she sweetly replies that everything is fine and that she's gotten used to the hard work, Elric feels deeply ashamed for offering such belated apologies to someone he himself abandoned to her fate for 10 years. Tyria glances at him sideways with her beautiful yellowish eyes, seeming to perfectly understand her husband's hidden melancholy. She explains delicately that she became accustomed to the heavy administrative work because she learned everything directly from the former patriarch, Hovin Portman. The young man is quite surprised by the revelation and silently agrees that teaching hard work in a practical way was indeed his father's ruthless way of dealing with people. His father had always been a controlling man who insisted on personally inspecting every inch of his properties, including the vast wheat fields in the Wibben region. With the liquidation of almost all the guild's companies, the only thing that remained of the old Portman Empire was that wheat farm, whose management the late father had made sure to pass entirely into Tyria's hands before he died. Suddenly, their footsteps stop simultaneously as they reach the front of the old house office. Taking advantage of the pause, Elric breaks the silence once more to ask his wife a very important question. Standing before the imposing portrait of Hovin Portman painted on the hallway wall, The young man seriously questions what his late father's last days were like. Tyria looks away melancholically and replies frankly that, apart from the hard lessons about managing the land, the two hardly spoke or shared personal moments in their daily lives. Hearing that, Elric gripped the handle of his wooden cane tightly, overcome internally by a mixture of anger and sadness. He gathers the courage to ask the question that tormented him most, wanting to know if his father ever mentioned his name during his long 10-year absence. To the boy's silent disappointment, Tyria replies quietly and frankly that the patriarch never touched on the subject or spoke about his whereabouts. In the end, he reflects that the combination of a father with a heart of stone and such a quiet woman would truly mean that any dialogue between them would be strictly limited to the bureaucratic business of the farm. Elric stares at the imposing portrait of his late father on the wall and murmurs with regret that he finally understands the isolated situation in which she lived. Tyria politely excuses herself, saying she needs to return to her daily duties, leaving Elric confused, as he believed she had finished her work for the day upon returning from the field. She explains matter-of-factly that she still has a mountain of accounting documents and sales reports to analyze and review in her personal office. Astonished by the obvious workload, the young foreman asks if she really takes care of the wheat harvest during the day and spends the entire nights reviewing the farm's bureaucratic paperwork. Without giving further details about his obvious tiredness, Tyria simply bids him farewell, saying he will see him again at dinner, and Elric accepts the farewell with an awkward nod. The young man watches her walk away down the imposing mansion hallway, once again overcome by a strong and unsettling feeling of guilt. Elric realizes with extreme bitterness that had he not run away from home so cowardly in his youth, all that exhausting administrative responsibility would have fallen on him, and not on the poor girl he abandoned without looking back. He feels his conscience would be much lighter if she hated him or complained about his absence, but, to his surprise, Tyria has never uttered a single word of complaint or lament during all these difficult years. He continues his way slowly through the silent corridors of the Portman mansion, dragging his injured leg in a melancholy and thoughtful manner. Suddenly, a very loud noise of something falling and breaking coming from one of the nearby rooms makes the boy stop in the hallway, startled. Peeking through the crack in the door, he comes across the clumsy maid Marie lying on the floor, surrounded by dozens of letters scattered everywhere. Marie panics when she sees the mess she's made with the important mail, while Elric watches her curiously, not quite understanding what caused the disaster. Ignoring her injured leg, the young teacher bends down to help her gather the scattered papers and takes the opportunity to ask who all those old letters with red wax seals belong to. The servant quickly explains that they are all official letters addressed directly to Tyria, leaving the young man quite intrigued as he examines the envelopes closely. He notes with astonishment the impressive amount of mail accumulated inside that small wooden box that fell, but his eyes widened in utter shock as he read the official sender's address written on the back of one of his wife's letters. It turns out that all of Tyria's letters had been sent directly from her former noble family, the Wibben, who one day sold her without any scruples for purely financial gain. Elric unfolds the yellowed paper with trembling hands and begins to carefully read the words written by Baron Wibben himself. In the letter, her father coldly pleaded with Tyria to stop waiting for a runaway husband who would never return and to steal all the remaining Portman fortune so she could finally come home, where he would find her a new, wealthy suitor. The young man realizes that, although Tyria dedicated 10 long years of hard work for the Portman family, her late father didn't leave her a single penny of the inheritance, which would justify any resentment she might have harbored towards him and Hoven. Elric puts the paper back on the wooden desk, knowing that if she wanted to steal all the Portman's wealth as his father had suggested in the letter, it would only be a fair price for all his silent suffering. He leans against his office desk with his head down, wondering if the only reason Tyria remains there is simply to inherit the remainder of her family's financial assets. But then, a much greater doubt begins to cruelly torment him in his deepest thoughts. He remains pensive in his quiet office, staring at the organized papers under the afternoon light streaming through the large window. His red eyes gleamed with the uncertainty of not truly understanding his wife's real intentions and feelings. After all, if her goal was simply to steal the Portman family's accumulated fortune, Tyria could have done so very easily shortly after the Baron's death a year ago, without having to continue working hard every day in the wheat fields. Elric meticulously examines the inventory documents on the table, unable to find a logical explanation for her otherwise upright behavior. Upon opening his father's desk drawer, he comes across a huge pile of letters sent to Tyria that appeared to have never been opened or answered. He picks up one of the envelopes, dated exactly 1 year ago, realizing that all of Baron Wibbin's insistent correspondence began arriving shortly after Hoven's death. He notes that the Baron's objective was always to force her to take Elric's inheritance money, but that Tyria probably never responded to any of those greedy messages, since the last envelopes went so far as to beg for a simple reply from her. Elric lets out a long sigh of relief and gives a bitter smile at the surprising new conclusions he has drawn about his wife. He finally understands that Tyria spent all those 10 years faithfully protecting the Portman family's inheritance and patrimony for a master whose return was never guaranteed by anyone. The young man realizes that since even the faithful butler Aldio was unaware of this family situation, Tyria must have made a tremendous effort to keep the whole truth a complete secret from everyone. This meant that, for the entire last year following Hoven Portman's tragic death, the young woman had been facing that arduous administrative and family battle completely alone in the mansion. She silently endured every humiliation, demand, and manipulation from her biological parents to protect Elric's financial legacy intact. With a heart heavy with guilt, Elric wonders why she chose to tread such a difficult and painful path in life, since he himself would never have the courage to blame her if she had decided to keep the entire inheritance for herself. Later, in her private chambers, Tyria delicately prepares herself in front of her gilded dressing table for her meeting with her husband. She carefully places a beautiful white ribbon bow in her long blonde hair, arranging herself impeccably in front of the mirror. Wearing an elegant and luxurious blue satin dress, the young noblewoman displays a stunning beauty worthy of royalty. During this moment of preparation, the young maid Marie rushes into the room, very excited to give her mistress an important message. Marie celebrates joyfully with her hands clasped together, rejoicing that, for the first time since returning from her trip, young Master Elric has personally asked to meet her in the tea room. Although I still find his behavior in the bathroom quite scandalous and shameless, Marie admits that the wise advice from the butler Aldio makes a lot of sense. The servant excitedly suggests that providing an heir to the Portman mansion soon would be wonderful to ensure Tyria's security, leaving her mistress quite flushed and surprised by such audacity. The little maid skips out of the room to allow the noblewoman to prepare for her grand meeting with her husband alone. Tyria clutched the fabric of her blue dress tightly and nervously, feeling her heart race with anxiety. Marie dramatically kneels beside her on the carpet before leaving, pleading in a prayerful tone that her mistress be strong. The maid sheds theatrical tears and comically insists that, although Elric is a perverted scoundrel who could escape again, the best thing for Tyria's safety is for the two of them to get closer and have a serious relationship as a couple. Marie screams at the top of her lungs that she must hurry up and share the bed with her husband and give the Portman mansion a beautiful baby as soon as possible. Tyria gives a forced smile of embarrassment as she listens to Marie sweetly ramble on about having several babies who inherit only their mother's beauty, to avoid them inheriting their father's runaway personality. But the amusing conversation is interrupted by the sudden sound of firm knocking on the door, which startles and silences both women at once. This is the butler Aldio announcing that everything is properly prepared for tea with the master, and Tyria politely replies from inside that she is leaving. The two walk with firm, silent steps through the long, elegant, carpeted corridors of Wibbin's mansion. Tyria followed the butler thoughtfully, her face flushed, curiously wondering what the real subject of the conversation was, since it was the first time Elric had requested a meeting with her. Butler Aldio slowly opens the gilded, sculpted doors to the mansion's luxurious tea room. He formally announces Tyria's arrival under the watchful and nervous gaze of Elric, who was anxiously awaiting her seated at the tea table. The young nobleman welcomes his wife graciously, pointing to the empty chair in front of him. Tyria enters the tea room timidly, head bowed, displaying all her innate elegance in her beautiful blue evening gown. She approaches the table with soft, firm steps, while Elric watches her intently, holding a delicate porcelain cup. The young man takes a sip of his hot tea, trying to somehow calm his immense nervousness in front of his wife. The two finally settle down, facing each other under the strong natural light that floods the luxurious tea room of the mansion. Elric begins the conversation by sincerely apologizing for opening her personal letters without permission after Marie's disastrous little accident in the hallway. He places Wibbin's sealed envelope on the tea table and asks directly if he can question her about the threatening content of those messages. Upon seeing her greedy family's mail in his hands, Tyria is completely paralyzed and in deep shock for a few moments. She immediately lowers her head, her face contorted with a heavy expression of sadness and embarrassment. The young noblewoman is internally panicked, fearing that Elric will see her only as a self-serving con artist who remained in the house for the Portman inheritance money. But to her relief, Elric very gently clarifies that he discovered she had spent the entire last year ignoring and categorically rejecting those letters from Baron Wibbin. He confesses that he called her there only because he needed to clear up a crucial doubt, asking why she had dedicated herself so much to protecting his inheritance if there was no guarantee that he would return alive from the war. Elric concludes by saying that she had every legal right to claim every penny of that immense fortune for herself after his disappearance for 10 years. Ultimately, for all practical purposes of fate, Tyria was practically a stranger in his life before the escape. A stranger so distant that the fact she had defended his inheritance against his own ambitious parents for 10 years was a complete mystery to the young man. Elric gazes at her sweetly and insists that she tell him once and for all the real reason she didn't return to the wealthy Wibbin home when she had the perfect opportunity. Tyria takes a deep breath, raises her head with determination, and proudly pronounces her husband's last name. She stares intently at him with her beautiful golden eyes and states with her head held high that her real name is now Tyria Portman. The girl finishes with conviction that she is no longer a noblewoman of the Wibbin family, but rather the rightful official lady of the Portman house. Then she gracefully rises from the table, apologizing, as she still needed to return to her exhausting bureaucratic duties for the day at the office. Tyria turns and begins walking towards the exit, leaving Elric to watch her leave in complete silence. The young man remained motionless in his chair in the tea room, completely paralyzed and deeply shocked by his wife's beautiful declaration of loyalty. He continues watching her back as she slowly walks away, head held high, through the imposing doorway of the room. However, behind that determined posture, Tyria's face was completely red with embarrassment at the memory of his sincere question at dinner. She bites her lip lightly in the hallway, deeply wishing she'd had the courage to reveal all her true, hidden romantic feelings to her husband. Tyria's face flushes intensely as she fondly remembers when she declared her complete loyalty to the young man. She repeats softly to herself that she is now indeed Elric's legitimate wife, feeling her chest warm with all the affection she has held back these past 10 years. Meanwhile, back in the mansion's private office, a hand grips a small silver dagger quite firmly. Elric sits deep in thought in his leather armchair, silently reflecting on the great determination his wife has shown in the tea room. In the young man's mind, Tyria's declaration that she was the mistress of the Portman house and that she no longer had any ties to the Wibbin family still echoed vividly. With a swift, dry movement, he buries the sharp tip of his blade directly against the wooden wall. The young man wonders if his wife's firm response was motivated solely by the strong sense of responsibility and duty she carries as a noblewoman by birth. All that unwavering dedication to protecting the Portman legacy made the former mercenary remember an important and respected figure from his past battles. The memory of Elvis Graham, a platinum-haired warrior who crossed his path during the war, resurfaces very vividly in his mind. The two met in the heat of the battlefield, where Elvis, the third son of an influential noble family, hired Kasha's services as a fighter to win a territorial dispute. But that great military victory came at an extremely high price. leaving the nobleman gravely wounded and condemned to spend the rest of his days in a wheelchair. Despite such physical limitations, Elvis maintained a serene smile on his face and affirmed that all of this was necessary to fulfill his role. The platinum-haired nobleman proudly argued that those born into privileged positions bear the inevitable burden of duty and must always serve as an example to others. At the time, the young mercenary found that dedication somewhat absurd and questioned whether he wasn't merely the son of a concubine, being half commoner by blood. Elvis simply smiled slightly and replied humorously that, being half noble, he had lost exactly half of his own body to fulfill his feudal obligations. The warrior retired permanently from the battlefield after the war and decided to live the rest of his days as a carefree man alongside his future wife. Back in the present reality, Elric thoughtfully stares at the dagger that remained embedded in the wooden wall of his office. He murmurs to himself about the relentless weight of duty, realizing that Tyria lives under precisely that same rigid philosophy of personal sacrifice. Although he knows he will never be able to compensate for his wife's 10 years of loneliness, Elric decides he will not stand idly by in the face of her situation. The young man is certain that the greedy letters from the Wibben family coveting the fortune will keep arriving, but he notices an intriguing detail. They never dare to visit them in person. Knowing that his wife would never reveal her deepest feelings if he questioned her directly, Elric decides to take matters into his own hands to solve this mystery. Fortunately for the young teacher, there is a very quick and direct way to uncover the whole truth behind that persistent family demand. His final destination could be none other than the imposing and luxurious official estate of the Wibben family. Upon arriving before the imposing golden gates of the noble residence, the young man assesses the facade with a serious gaze, determined to make a direct approach to his in-laws. Wearing an impeccable and perfectly tailored suit, Elric sarcastically comments on the grandeur of that aristocratic building as he walks towards the main entrance. Inside the luxurious mansion, news of the Portman heir's sudden arrival spreads quickly, causing a real stir behind the scenes of the family. Baron Wibben walks angrily beside his wife, grumbling that the surprise appearance of that insignificant commoner son-in-law at the mansion is sheer audacity. The Baroness, fan in hand, spewed all her venom, complaining that the young man should have disappeared forever, and accusing him of rushing back only to claim his deceased father's inheritance. The Baron's gaze grows utterly grim as he contemplates the terrifying possibility of the young man attempting to officially take control of Hoven's entire fortune. The two continue walking briskly through the decorated corridors of the mansion, plotting a way to reverse their financial crisis before facing the visitor. With long, firm strides, the noble couple exudes all their aristocratic pomposity as they make their way to the reception room where their son-in-law awaits them. The Baron grumbles with deep contempt about the Portman's plebeian origins, cursing the boy as a self-serving trash who only cares about money. The wife fully agrees and adds that Elric wasted 10 years of Tyria's life, dramatically recalling all the fortune they supposedly spent raising their daughter. For the two bankrupt aristocrats, the immense and valuable inheritance left by Hoven Portman was the only thing that truly mattered in saving their family name. The noblemen raged that they absolutely needed to use that mountain of gold coins to pay off all their debts and restore the prestige of the Wibben family. He grips the golden doorknob tightly and flings open the living room door with a decisive shove. Upon entering the luxurious room, the nobles find Elric seated calmly in the guest chair, resting his elegant black cane between his legs. The young man bows very politely and formally introduces himself as Elric Portman, ironically apologizing for taking so long to come and greet them personally. Seated at the tea table, the in-laws stare at him with extreme hostility, with the Baroness commenting disdainfully that it had been incredibly difficult to see her son-in-law's face for an entire decade. Elric ignores the two men's biting provocations and gets straight to the point of the visit, calmly revealing that he found the threatening letters they sent to Tyria at the mansion. The Baron finds the situation amusing and cynically says that now that the secret has been revealed, they can speed up the discussion, justifying that he sent the letters only out of pure paternal concern about his daughter's abandonment. He points his finger at the young man and accuses him of being a shameless, ungrateful wretch who abandoned his wife, even after the traditional Wibben family granted noble status to simple merchants. The nobleman chuckled mockingly upon noticing his son-in-law's cane, ridiculing Elric's physical condition, and questioning whether a cripple of low birth would have any ability to manage such a large inheritance. Clearing his throat with superiority, he makes a point of emphasizing that all the remaining fortune was managed solely by Tyria during those long 10 years of Elric's absence. Without hesitation or a shred of shame, Baron Wibben openly demands that the entire Portman inheritance be handed over to him as compensation for the suffering of his abandoned daughter. He continues to exude arrogance, stating disdainfully that it would be a real waste to leave such colossal wealth in the hands of a young man so unprepared and useless in business. The Baroness supports him, hiding a cynical smile behind her fan, claiming that her son-in-law has no administrative capacity whatsoever and falsely lamenting all the emotional pain her daughter went through alone. Behind the mask of family concern, the aristocratic couple displays their true greedy and gold-hungry nature, stating that they will make excellent use of all that wealth. Faced with such a spectacle of pure greed and hypocrisy from his in-laws, Elric merely lets out a long sigh and a very cold smile slips from the corner of his mouth. The former mercenary's eyes flushed intensely with pure hatred as he realized that those unscrupulous monsters were using Tyria's suffering as a cheap excuse to steal the Portman family's entire inheritance. Elric clearly realizes that his in-laws don't care at all about Tyria's well-being, interested only in taking the lands and filling their own pockets with the Portman gold. Feeling deeply disgusted by that blatant hypocrisy, the young man decides he has heard enough of that repugnant conversation. He smiles calmly and takes the floor, subtly cutting off their chatter. Elric begins by apologizing for not bringing his wife with him, coldly explaining that she is too busy taking care of her administrative duties on the farm. Baron Joseph slammed his fist on the table and shouted angrily, demanding that his son-in-law stop trying to change the subject in the middle of such an important discussion about the inheritance. The nobleman continued to rant arrogantly, demanding that the young man hand over all the fortune immediately and questioning whether he truly thought it fair to claim anything after having abandoned the city for 10 years. Faced with such audacity, Elric brings his hand to his face and lets out a sarcastic laugh, repeating the word greed in a mocking tone. With a menacing look and eyes gleaming red, the former mercenary stares at his father-in-law and asks what exactly Lord Joseph intends to do if he decides to act on such greed. The Baron swallows hard and stammers, startled by the abrupt change in tone, while Elric reinforces the provocation, challenging him to say what he will do if he decides to keep every penny. Elric goads him into speaking, mockingly questioning why the man who had been shouting with such authority just seconds before had now remained completely silent. He asks mercilessly if his father-in-law's arrogant mouth has suddenly dried up under the weight of his overwhelming presence. Trembling and sweating profusely from sheer nervousness, Baron Joseph rises, shouting in outrage at the boy's boundless insolence. But the young man merely stares at him with a grim look, coldly stating that his father-in-law has finally begun to understand who he is really dealing with there. The young man internally recalls spending an entire decade surviving on the continent's worst battlefields, where he learned that there is no need to cause scandals or display senseless rage to subdue an opponent. In war, extreme coldness was his greatest weapon, for he knew very well that silent brutality resolved any impasse in a much more definitive way. Elric then advises his father-in-law to remain silent from then on if he still wants to continue receiving the small monthly financial assistance that his daughter secretly sent them. He gives a wry smile and comments on how comical the whole situation is, since the only person with a real moral right to the property is Tyria, while the two meddlers are nothing more than parasites without any authority putting on a ridiculous show. As he turns to leave, the young man ruthlessly concludes that the only people truly blinded by greed inside are the young woman's own parents. The Baron shouts in despair and threatens to go to the Portman mansion to destroy everything. But Elric continues walking unconcerned and calmly tells him to try his luck if he dares. With one last menacing glance over his shoulder, the young man coldly warns that he will be eagerly awaiting their visit. Shortly after, Elric's carriage sets off on its return journey, cutting along the peaceful dirt road surrounded by verdant trees under the afternoon sun. Inside the vehicle, however, all that imposing pose of the young man disappears, and he lets out a deep sigh of exhaustion, covering his face with trembling hands. A terrible wave of guilt consumes him as he realizes that, despite having defended Tyria, he himself is not much different from those self-serving monsters, since he too abandoned her for 10 years and remains a great sinner in her eyes. Elric begins to question whether all the fury he displayed in the drawing room was truly motivated by a desire to protect his wife from the humiliations of her parents. Or perhaps he simply acted in that arrogant manner, driven only by a selfish and distorted sense of moral superiority over the bankrupt nobles. He bitterly admits that the feeling at the moment of the confrontation was not compassion for Tyria, but rather a bizarre pleasure in using his military strength to crush and silence those arrogant people. At that moment, the cold, authoritative voice of his deceased father echoed in his memories, demanding that he pay for the support he received during his childhood. The young man realizes with horror that he has transformed into exactly the same kind of heartless and selfish monster his father used to be. But his torturous train of thought is interrupted when the coachman slams on the brakes with a loud thud of the harness. The boy forcefully pushes open the car door and hurries out into the middle of the dirt road. Completely overwhelmed by his own self-loathing, he leans against the side of the vehicle and begins to vomit from sheer physical and emotional distress. Elric is breathing heavily, trying somehow to catch his breath as the cool breeze of the countryside hits his sweaty face. Leaning against the carriage under the autumn sky, he whispers with utter sadness that he sees himself only as a despicable and utterly hopeless human being. But suddenly, a faint rustling of leaves and branches catches the attention of the boy right behind where he was standing. He turns to the side, still quite breathless, trying to identify the source of that subtle sound amidst the low vegetation. The ex-mercenary's eyes widened in utter shock as he focused on a very familiar silhouette on the horizon of the wheat field. Before him, under the beautiful, soft, golden light of dusk, stood his wife Tyria, walking peacefully through the vast wheat field of the estate. The wind blows strongly, ruffling her long golden hair, creating an image of such pure beauty that it leaves the young man completely speechless. The young man feels a lump forming in his throat, and can only manage to utter his beloved's name in a very low, emotional whisper. Completely forgetting about his cane and ignoring the intense pain in his injured leg, Elric begins to run desperately towards her. As he walks with difficulty through the wheat field, he tortures himself thinking about the unimaginable suffering she must have endured alone at the hands of her own biological parents, and also under the ruthless control of her late father, who treated her merely as a cold, business-minded administrative tool. The clumsy Marie and the elderly Aldio watch the scene from afar in complete shock, unable to understand why the young master is running so desperately without his cane. Hearing the rhythmic sound of hurried footsteps approaching, Tyria turns slowly in the golden light, her expression filled with surprise. Without hesitating for another second, Elric extends his arms and firmly grasps his wife's delicate wrist. Tyria stares at him, frightened, and asks softly what is happening, while the boy leans before her with his head bowed, overcome by strong emotion. In the midst of that vast expanse of golden wheat, the proud former mercenary bows before his wife in a gesture of profound and sincere humility. With a trembling voice choked with regret, he begs forgiveness from the bottom of his heart for abandoning her alone for 10 long years and for trying to justify his cowardly escape as if it were for her own good. Elric keeps his head down and confesses with deep regret that everything she had to face and endure in silence during that entire decade of solitude was caused solely by him. He concludes his painful outburst by reaffirming that he takes full responsibility for his pain, while Tyria watches him with wide eyes, a mixture of surprise and deep emotion under the twilight light. Suddenly, Tyria's mind travels to the past, remembering the day a brave little boy wielded a piece of wood to scare away 3 ferocious dogs that threatened her in the forest. After driving the animals away with determination, little Elric turned to her and asked worriedly if she was all right, or if she had been bitten anywhere. The girl replied softly that she was fine, but pointed nervously to the boy's leg, which was badly scratched and bleeding from the animal attack. The little boy got a huge fright when he looked down, complaining angrily that those damned beasts had really managed to leave a nasty mark on his shin. Somewhat awkwardly, and with cheeks flushed with shyness, little Tyria sweetly asked him to come closer for a moment so she could help. As she carefully bandaged the wound, the boy proudly introduced himself as Elric Portman, saying he only helped because the incident occurred on his own family's land. Seeing her silence, little Elric asked if she was always so quiet and commented that it would be good if she were nice to him, since in the future he would become a great royal knight. The little girl remained in complete silence, becoming even more embarrassed and blushing at all his enthusiastic chatter. After finishing the bandage with extreme delicacy, she gently announced that it was ready, and the boy accepted the help with a slightly awkward smile and flushed cheeks. Quite impressed, young Elric commented that she looked very much like a noble young lady, but wondered, intrigued, where a girl of that class had learned to treat wounds with such practical skill. She tried to explain very quietly that her nanny always took care of her injuries, but Elric complained that he couldn't hear anything and asked her to speak a little louder. The girl simply shrugged and became even more embarrassed, lacking the courage to raise her voice to answer his question. The boy let out a disgruntled sigh and joked that, with such a shy and quiet personality, she would certainly have extreme difficulty getting married in the future. But then, immediately afterwards, he himself turned extremely red with embarrassment and blurted out without thinking that, should he become a royal knight, he would accept her as his bride anyway. Hearing that unexpected proposal made little Tyria's heart race with pure emotion and surprise under the afternoon sunlight. Seeing that she remained completely silent, the little boy panicked with embarrassment and began to shout defensively, telling her not to get too big for her britches, just because she was pretty, and making up a story that he only wanted her around because of her medical skills. He ran off at a brisk pace, shouting that in the future she would beg to marry him, furious at having been completely ignored by the girl until the very last second of his escape. As soon as the boy disappeared from sight down the road, little Tyria smiled an extremely sweet and gentle smile, keeping that precious memory deep in her heart. She began researching everything about him with care, keeping Elric Portman's name as her greatest childhood secret. Back in the present, the beautiful young noblewoman lovingly holds the small picture frame containing a photo of her husband when he was just a mischievous little boy with bandaged cheeks. She smiles very affectionately as she reflects that, although he never became the royal knight he promised to be, their eventual reunion at the mansion could only be the work of a beautiful destiny. As the sun begins to set, tinging the sky with golden and reddish hues, the housekeeper Rhonda orders Marie in the corridors to prepare a beautiful tea set for the noble couple. Rhonda walked with rhythmic and elegant steps down the imposing corridor of the mansion, guiding Tyria towards the office where her husband awaited her. The young noblewoman follows the governess with a pensive expression, worried after hearing from Rhonda that her husband's face seemed quite serious and tense upon returning from his morning outing. She felt a pang of anxiety in her chest, silently wondering what Elric's real reason was for requesting her presence in the office in such a formal manner. Rhonda gently knocks on the imposing wooden door and respectfully announces that the young lady has just arrived for the scheduled meeting. Inside the spacious room bathed in the soft afternoon light, Elric remained seated with a thoughtful expression, deeply saddened by his wife's presence. Tyria timidly takes the initiative and gently says that she also has an important personal matter that she would very much like to share with him at that moment. But the young man gently interrupts her, confessing that he asked to see her precisely because he desperately needed to tell her something very important from the bottom of his heart. Looking into his wife's beautiful golden eyes with complete sincerity, the young man pronounces a formal apology that echoes deeply, movingly through the living room. Tyria puts her hand to her mouth in utter shock and asks, startled, what that means, completely unprepared by such an unexpected action from her husband. The young master explains with regret that he needed to ask forgiveness for having left her behind completely alone right after their wedding ceremony 10 years ago. He bitterly admits that at the time he was a foolish, immature, an extremely impulsive boy who acted recklessly without considering the suffering he would cause her with his cowardly escape. He concludes by saying that he now fully understands all the emotional wounds and immense administrative difficulties she was forced to endure completely helpless in the mansion. Elric looks at her with a hopeful gaze and asks, his chest heavy, if she would be able to accept his sincere, belated apologies for the past. Tyria observes him with extreme sweetness and replies very calmly that he has no real reason to apologize for everything that happened. The young woman calmly clarifies that she never held any grudge against him or anyone else, emphasizing with conviction that remaining to work at the Portman mansion was always a personal choice and entirely her own. Elric listened to those moving words with a heavy heart, realizing how much his wife's kindness and nobility of character overcame any past resentment. She then smiles intensely, tenderly, and warmly, saying affectionately that she will accept his apologies so that her husband's heart can finally find the peace it so desperately needs. Hearing that beautiful declaration of forgiveness brings a sincere and deeply relieved smile to Elric's lips, turning his cheeks a light red. He wholeheartedly thanks Tyria for her immense generosity, affectionately addressing her by her title while displaying an expression of extreme happiness. The two stand up and begin walking side by side through the main hall, the boy dragging his injured leg in rhythmic steps with the aid of his cane. Tyria glances at him sideways with concern and asks affectionately if his leg is feeling a little better today, and the young master quickly replies that it's fine. Elric politely apologizes for taking up her precious time amidst such an exhausting work schedule, but she gently asks him not to say anything foolish about bothering her. Taking advantage of the light-hearted atmosphere and the restored closeness between the couple, Tyria hesitates for a moment and says that she needs to make a very special request about their relationship. Completely blushing and with her eyes shining with shyness, the young noblewoman asks if, instead of continuing to address her so distantly by her title of lady, he could start calling her by another name. She tries to stammer the final words with extreme embarrassment, whispering almost inaudibly the intimate term she wished he would use from then on. Elric tilts his head, confused because he can't hear the muffled phrase clearly, and apologizes, asking her to repeat what she was trying to suggest. But the sweet and romantic scene is suddenly ruined when the clumsy Marie kicks open the office door with a resounding thud, shouting at the top of her lungs that it's finally tea time. The sudden shock of the loud banging of the door causes Elric to completely lose his balance on his injured leg, throwing his cane aside as he falls awkwardly onto the carpet amidst his wife's panicked screams. With the sudden loss of balance, Elric falls hard directly on top of his wife's body on the living room floor. Upon encountering the extremely compromising scene, the servants are speechless, and old Aldio jokingly asks if the couple was already planning the arrival of an heir to the mansion. Elric stood up quickly, his face burning with shame, shouting desperately to the butler that the situation was nothing like what he had thought. Marie panics completely, apologizing to her boss, while Aldio covers the young maid's eyes and whispers, amused, that they should pretend they didn't see that intimate moment between adults. The butler nods in agreement and promises to warn all the other servants never to disturb the couple when they are alone from now on, leaving the young master even more furious and embarrassed by the misunderstanding. Sweating profusely and gesturing wildly, Elric desperately tries to explain himself to Tyria in a minimally rational way to diffuse the awkward atmosphere. Still lying on the rug with her face completely red, the young woman timidly asks her husband to move away a little, and he hastily apologizes for the incident. Before closing the door for good, Aldio takes one last amused peek through the gap and wishes the two of them a pleasant time together, ignoring the boy's cries of protest. The door finally slams shut with a dry bang, bringing an end to that hilarious intrusion by the servants. Even with the mansion shrouded in the silence of the night, the desperate cries of the young man trying to deny what had happened could still be heard echoing through the illuminated windows of the large house. The following morning, the pleasant bird song announces the start of a new sunny day in the lands of Wibben. Inside the main room, Rhonda notices a coughing sound and asks with her usual kindness if the young master is already up. Elric finishes buttoning his nightshirt and politely wishes the housekeeper a good morning as she sees him enter the rooms. Observing his expression, Rhonda comments with a knowing smile that the young man seems to be in a very good mood today, asking if anything special happened the previous night. She approaches slowly and whispers mysteriously, wondering if all that morning cheerfulness is directly related to the future arrival of a Portman heir. The boy blushed deeply and angrily exclaimed that regardless of the vile gossip old Aldio had been spreading, absolutely none of that had happened between them. Rhonda laughs, amused by his reaction, and as she turns to leave, comments seriously that the events of the previous night shouldn't be treated as just a mere runner's accident. Seeing the boy's confused expression, the housekeeper turns abruptly and firmly asks if he truly doesn't understand the seriousness of his actions. She approaches with an imposing gaze and reminds him that Elric spent 10 long years away from home, emphasizing that the weight of that time of abandonment is infinitely greater for a woman and demanding that he never again let Tyria feel lonely. Meanwhile, in her reddish-toned chambers, Tyria continued to sleep peacefully in her immense double bed. Upon waking with the first rays of sunlight, the young woman stretches with a very sweet smile and reflects that her morning seems much more invigorating and happy than usual. Holding the small childhood portrait of her husband against her chest, she whispers a tender good morning wish directed towards her beloved master. She places the painting back on the marble dressing table, feeling immensely happy to realize that the barrier of distance between them has finally begun to diminish after yesterday's conversation. With her heart overflowing with joy, Tyria stretches happily in her blue nightgown and wonders if she should start greeting him personally every morning from now on. Outside, the gentle early morning breeze softly sways the immense bales of golden wheat scattered across the farm. In the mansion's dining room, the couple gathers to enjoy the first meal of the day at a beautifully decorated dining table. Breakfast consists of generous portions of fried eggs, crispy bacon, and toast, all meticulously prepared by the cooks. Tyria savors the food in a very graceful and calm manner, demonstrating that she is quite happy with the start of that day. Elric bites into his toast thoughtfully, feeling extremely uncomfortable and unsure how to break the awkward silence that had formed between them. The image of his beautiful wife lying on the floor, begging him to move away, flashes through his mind instantly, making him sweat nervously and almost choke on his food. Noticing his agitation, Tyria gently calls him by his title, and the boy jumps in his chair in fright, responding hastily and stammering with embarrassment. Visibly embarrassed and with flushed cheeks, the young noblewoman delicately asks if he has some free time today to accompany her on a walk around the area. Elric pauses for a moment and repeats the proposal, confused, not expecting an invitation for a walk directly from her. Startled by his hesitation, Tyria hastily tries to justify herself, saying that the harvest festival is approaching and that, since the new lord of those lands has returned, a routine inspection would be very prudent for the farm. The young man smiles tenderly, understanding his wife's shyness, and agrees that the approaching harvest festival truly calls for both of them to be present. With a very friendly expression, he readily accepts the invitation and assures her that he will be sure to accompany her throughout the property inspection. The positive response brings an extremely gentle and relieved smile to the beautiful face of the young noblewoman. Later, backstage in the mansion's dressing room, the maids' voices echoed through the corridors as they adjusted the final details of Tyria's attire for the outing. With the help of Marie and the other employees under Rhonda's watchful eye, the boss tries on an elegant and very well-fitting dark dress with blue details. Pleased with how well the clothes fit her mistress, Rhonda orders Marie to continue assisting her while she retires to check the attire the young master has chosen. Rhonda opens the door to Elric's quarters and, upon hearing him say that he was ready, smiles kindly, praising the young man's efficiency in the preparations. However, the housekeeper's cheerful expression changes drastically in the same second as she focuses her sharp eyes on the bizarre clothes the young man has decided to wear. To the housekeeper's astonishment, Elric appears dressed in full adventurer's attire, complete with a leather vest and a gigantic hat, confusedly questioning what other clothing would be more efficient for walking in the countryside. Rhonda grabs him firmly and begins dragging him back down the corridor, angrily shouting that they're going for a peaceful inspection, not a battlefield dressed as bandits. She forcefully opens the doors to the official locker room amidst the loud protests of the young man. Elric awkwardly tries to break free, insisting that he is perfectly capable of choosing his own clothes to go out alone without her help. Completely ignoring the young master's complaints, Rhonda unceremoniously pushes him toward a comfortable chair to begin the visual transformation. Adjusting her white gloves in a rather menacing manner, and with a frightening smile on her face, she decrees that a true nobleman must dress with dignity, and that she will change that tacky look right now. Without wasting any time, the governess begins to roughly tear off each of the dark-colored items the young man has chosen, throwing his hat and leather vest aside. Laughing desperately as he tries to cover himself, Elric begs her to stop pulling at his clothes and just select the right pieces so he can dress himself in peace. Rhonda laughs playfully and asks mockingly if the young master is ashamed of her, jokingly reminding him that he used to take off all his clothes and run barefoot around the mansion when he was just a little boy. Ignoring the boy's embarrassed protests, the governess firmly grasps him by the collar of his shirt and demands that he stop complaining. With a swift and ruthless movement, she rips open his shirt in one swift motion, tearing the fabric away amidst Elric's terrified screams. However, Rhonda's playful smile vanishes instantly, giving way to an expression of pure shock as she covers her mouth with her hands. Before her eyes lay Elric's muscular chest, completely scarred by dozens of deep, frightening sword cuts accumulated over years of war. The governess begins to tremble visibly with sadness and panic, whispering in horror at what could have caused so many brutal marks on the young master's body. Elric awkwardly tries to cover his chest and comments amicably that it was precisely because of all those battle scars that he insisted so much on dressing himself in his room. Rhonda stares at him, her eyes brimming with tears, desperately pleading with him to tell her what kind of terrible suffering he endured during all these years of absence. The young man leans in affectionately and, gently touching the housekeeper's face, offers a sincere apology and promises to reveal the whole truth when the time is right. He manages a gentle smile and begs from the bottom of his heart for Rhonda to keep it a complete secret, preventing Tyria from seeing his scars and suffering because of him. Rhonda swallows back tears of pain and presses the young master's hand to her chest, overcome with deep compassion for her beloved master's ordeal. Wiping away her tears gracefully, she agrees to the request and assures him that from now on she will be solely responsible for helping him with his clothes, to prevent others from discovering his secret. Shortly after, Elric slowly walks to the outer courtyard and asks the faithful butler if the carriage for the ride is properly prepared. He now sports an extremely elegant look, befitting a true lord, with a charming smile that highlights his presence. Aldio laughs with relief and comments that he feared the boss would show up dressed as a country bandit to scare his wife, but realizes that all his worries were in vain. The boy gives an awkward laugh and admits that it almost really happened. But Rhonda's energetic intervention ended up saving his look at the last minute. At that moment, soft footsteps catch the pair's attention, and the butler bows respectfully, apologizing for the delay in getting everything ready. Tyria appears stunning in her beautiful blue evening gown, and with flushed cheeks, asks how her look turned out, confessing that she put a lot of effort into her first date. Elric is completely paralyzed and mesmerized by so much beauty, managing only to stammer that she is absolutely gorgeous. The young woman happily thanks her for the sincere compliment, while Rhonda watches from afar and sighs at the genuine smile on Tyria's face, deciding to keep the secret of the scars to protect that happiness. Holding hands under the beautiful blue sky, Elric asks if they can begin their journey, and the young woman happily agrees as they walk towards the vehicle. Upon arriving at the bustling local market square on the Portman estate, an excited voice cuts through the noisy crowd, drawing the attention of all the local residents. Several market vendors and farmers begin to whisper in surprise upon seeing the couple, quickly spreading the news that the heir who had run away from home has finally returned. Elric greets everyone with great warmth and cordiality, walking arm in arm with his wife and sincerely wishing everyone in the city well. In the grocery district, the kind Aunt Michelle runs towards him, very excited, celebrating the fact that the mischievous little boy from the past has transformed into such a handsome and imposing man. In the inn area, old acquaintances of the family also appear to greet him warmly, quite surprised and happy about the young man's permanent return. But their smiles give way to a worried expression when they notice Elric's cane, questioning what happened to his leg and joking that the future lord of those lands needs to always be strong and healthy. Elric turned around in surprise when he heard a very familiar voice shouting his old childhood nickname in the middle of the market street. It's Bart, the boy's best childhood friend, who comes running in with a huge smile on his face upon confirming the identity of his old adventure partner. The two friends greet each other with an extremely firm handshake, full of emotion reflecting on their long separation. Elric laughs happily, saying that his friend hasn't changed at all, while Bart jokes that the boy has changed so much physically that it was almost impossible to recognize him at first glance. The blond man gives Tyria a friendly bow and greets her respectfully, receiving a sweet wish of well-being from the young lady of the mansion. Bart excitedly points towards the local tavern and enthusiastically invites Elric to stop by during the evening festivities for a drink. The young man gladly accepts the invitation and taps his chest in confirmation, assuring them that they will meet later to talk calmly. Bart waves excitedly from afar as he watches the couple patiently resume their stroll through the bustling shopping streets. The young man smiles contentedly and confesses to himself that although he never expected to see those two married in the past, they now form an incredibly beautiful and harmonious couple. In the late afternoon, the royal carriage begins its return journey under the beautiful orange sky above the wheat fields of Wibben. Inside the silent train car, Tyria intently reads a bound book, completely absorbed in the soft light of dusk. Intrigued by his wife's reading, Elric notices that the book's title refers to a complete encyclopedia of botany and plants of the region. He breaks the silence gently and calls his wife by name, immediately capturing her attention inside the vehicle. The young woman lowers the book, slightly embarrassed, and replies meekly, anxiously awaiting her companion's next words. Elric smiles warmly and reveals seriously that he wishes to begin helping manage all of the Portman family's lands and properties, asking her to teach him the practical aspects of the job. He confesses with a heavy heart that he feels very guilty for her having carried all that administrative burden alone and assures her that he wants to assume his responsibility as the head of the household, even if it is belatedly. The young man insists that, with her proper guidance, he can certainly be very useful in the farm's affairs, leaving the young noblewoman completely red with embarrassment behind her book. With an extremely happy smile, Tyria's heart races as she thinks about how mature, reliable, and protective her husband has become since his return. She gently closes the book on her lap, feeling an immense peace wash over her soul in that instant. She looks at him with a mischievous glance and asks affectionately if she could be a rather strict teacher with him, just as the late patriarch Portman used to be in his management lessons. Elric lets out a very light laugh and happily agrees to the proposal, accepting the challenge with a heart overflowing with relief. As the carriage moves along the road, the boy playfully asks if his father really treated her so harshly during lessons, and she replies proudly that she always learned everything very quickly. While tranquility reigns in the lands of Wibben, the story takes us back to a bustling and noisy tavern located near the dangerous border of Chivor. The interior of the establishment is packed with noisy adventurers, travelers, and mercenaries chatting amidst mugs of liquor. Suddenly, the noise in the hall is interrupted by the firm footsteps of a mysterious figure who orders everyone to pay close attention to her. The tavern keeper stopped cleaning his glasses immediately, looking intrigued toward the entrance upon hearing that authoritative and unfamiliar voice. Standing before the wooden door under the torchlight, a young woman with long red hair and a dark cloak coldly announces that she will only ask that question once. With a sharp and relentless gaze, she demands to know immediately where Kasha, the legendary sword demon, is. Far away, the beautiful sunset gilds the sky above the Portman family's main house, marking the beginning of the local harvest festivities. Inside the silent office, only the rhythmic sound of a pen typing on the farm's harvest reports can be heard. Elric observes the stack of papers beside his wife and asks worriedly if she always has to deal with so much bureaucracy, and she replies that this overload only occurs during the busiest harvest seasons. Tyria pauses her writing for a moment and timidly calls him by the title, receiving gentle encouragement from her husband to say what she wants. With flushed cheeks, the young noblewoman asks if he would consider making an official public announcement to celebrate his permanent return to the family lands. The young man becomes quite awkward and repeats the proposal, confused, thoughtfully reflecting on how strange it would be to give a celebratory speech in front of all the residents. At that moment, the terrible memories of his life as a mercenary come rushing back, making him recall the cruel speeches of commanders who incited warriors to the merciless massacre of their enemies. He remembers that during his bloody days as the feared Kasha, he simply ignored and despised any military pronouncements, knowing they were all pure hypocrisy. The former mercenary never stood on a public speaking platform and never had the slightest intention of doing anything of the sort in his entire life dedicated to survival. Ultimately, the only true reason he set foot on so many bloody battlefields was never glory or duty, but rather the desperate need to find a physical target to unleash all the rage and hatred accumulated in his wounded heart. With swift and brutal movements, he charged at his opponents, tearing apart anyone who crossed his path without any remorse. Acting like a wild, reckless animal, the boy simply slaughtered without hesitation anyone who stood in front of him in the mud. He bitterly questions whether a murderous monster like himself would have any moral right to give a beautiful celebratory speech until his wife's gentle voice brings him back to reality. Elric shakes his head in fright and quickly apologizes, gesturing with his hands, explaining that he was just distracted by his own thoughts for a moment. He then flashes a friendly smile and proposes a much more comfortable alternative idea, suggesting that Tyria make the official announcement while he stands firmly by her side to support her. The young noblewoman accepts the proposal willingly with a sweet smile and agrees that she herself will take on the responsibility of welcoming the newcomers. She fondly considers next year's festival and concludes with a warm heart that having her beloved husband by her side is more than enough to make her happy. On the day of the event, the main square is completely packed with farmers who listen attentively to Tyria's beautiful opening, thanking everyone for their effort and dedication to this year's harvest. With all her usual elegance and charm, she concludes the statement by wishing everyone to make the most of the festivities on that special day. The crowd of market vendors and farmers erupts in shouts of celebration and warm applause at the official opening of the festival. Holding hands in the center of the square, Tyria affectionately suggests that the two of them also start strolling through the food and entertainment stalls of the market. The locals point in amazement as they watch the young couple approach arm in arm, commenting with admiration on the obvious harmony between them. A very friendly market vendor approaches, carrying a bowl of steaming stew, and affectionately begs her boss to try some of her seasonings. Immediately afterwards, another merchant respectfully offers a large mug of ice-cold beer so that the young lord can celebrate with them. Elric gladly accepts the drink and thanks everyone for their generosity, wishing a wonderful harvest festival to every villager he passes along the way. But suddenly, Tyria's attention is captured by something in the center of the square, causing her to open her eyes in complete astonishment. With a very lively and childlike smile, she points towards a stage set up just ahead and asks her husband to look. On the performance stage, an artist announces to the Wibben audience a rare and very special performance that will be conducted by court jesters. The court jester firmly holds a gleaming sword by the hilt and announces that the next act will be the classic trick of swallowing the blade. The man tilts his head back and slides the metal blade directly into his mouth. Under Tyria's terrified gaze and Elric's neutral expression, the young noblewoman is completely amazed by the artist's skill and begins to applaud enthusiastically and joyfully amidst the crowd. Elric glances at her sideways with a focused expression, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with the nature of this artistic performance. Noticing his disinterest, she asks if he didn't find the trick impressive, and the young man makes excuses, saying he's just seen many sword swallowers before, without the courage to reveal that in his past during the war, enemies swallowed swords in a very different way. As the couple continues their walk past the attractions, they pass a large wooden sign advertising the knife-throwing game. The stallholder notices their presence and enthusiastically challenges the young lord to a round of the game. Drawing the attention of several children who gather around, He points to 3 red apples hanging from thin wooden strings and promises a nice special prize if the boy manages to hit the targets. Elric hesitates thoughtfully and remarks amicably that it's been quite a while since he last held a knife, but the local children begin excitedly begging to see the new master demonstrate his marksmanship. Tyria supports the idea and affectionately holds her husband's arm, saying with a sweet smile that even the children are curious to see and encouraging him to join in the game. Yielding tenderly to his wife's request, Elric slowly walks to the launch line while the children jump for joy around him. The stall owner tries to reassure him, telling him in a friendly tone not to get too nervous, unaware of the surgical aim of a former elite professional mercenary. With quick, almost imperceptible movements, the boy throws the blades with such precision that all 3 apples are cut and impaled on the wooden supports at once. The market vendor turns completely pale and his mouth drops open in shock, while the boys let out high-pitched cries of pure admiration at that unbelievable aim. Tyria places her hands on her chest, her face flushed, marveling, and her eyes shining intensely at the enormous talent demonstrated by her husband. Noticing the stunned silence of everyone around him, Elric sweats nervously and wonders regretfully if he should have feigned poor aim to disguise his deadly combat skills. Elric tries to disguise his extraordinary agility with a forced smile, awkwardly joking that it was all just beginner's luck to try and save face in her eyes. Completely delighted with her husband's performance, Tyria clasps her hands and excitedly praises him, saying it was incredible and that she felt like she was watching a real knight in action. The young man watches her fondly, and feeling a slight flush on his face, is immensely happy to see that the festival's cheerful atmosphere has left his wife so lively and smiling. At that moment, the market vendor extends his arms to present the young master with the well-deserved prize for his impeccable aim. The man smiles and explains that the Merchants' Guild prepared that generous basket of colonial eggs, especially as the grand prize for the egg-throwing game. With great generosity, Elric refuses the prize for himself and asks the market vendor to distribute all the eggs to the local children, who excitedly celebrate, calling him the best man of all. Tyria gazes at him, her eyes shining with pride and admiration, whispering sweetly about how kind and gentle he can be with the villagers. The boy awkwardly rubs the back of his neck in embarrassment and explains nostalgically that he was simply remembering his childhood, recalling how happy he was when he received similar baskets of eggs and was lucky enough to find a golden egg inside. Upon hearing the story, Tyria lets out a hearty laugh and fondly recalls how the boy traded that precious golden egg for Mr. Herman's enormous metal helmet, which was so disproportionate it looked like an upside-down bucket on his boyish head. Elric stopped abruptly in his tracks, his eyes wide with surprise, wondering in horror how his wife could possibly know such an intimate detail about his childhood escapades. Realizing she had said too much, the young noblewoman sweated nervously and tried to disguise her blunder by stammering that he was the most famous troublemaker in the whole village, and that rumors of his mischief spread quickly everywhere. However, in her innermost thoughts, she repeats to herself with extreme shame that she would never have the courage to confess the true origin of her discovery. After all, she spent her entire childhood secretly watching the boy from behind the trees, simply because her greatest dream had always been to become the rightful bride of that mischievous boy. Her husband's gentle call brings the young woman back to reality, making her refocus on her stroll through the food court. Extending his hand to her with an extremely charming smile under the setting sun, the young man announces that the big party of the night is about to begin and asks if they can go to the main square. Tyria gently places her hand over his and nods affectionately, feeling her heart race with the physical closeness. Night finally falls on the lands of Wibben, and a market vendor raises a lit torch before the entire crowd, announcing the start of the traditional lighting ceremony to kick off the nighttime festivities. Bart takes control of the microphone on the platform and publicly thanks the distinguished couple for their presence in the square, declaring with sympathy that the festival's splendor mirrors the stunning beauty of his wife. Amidst the laughter and applause of the citizens, Elric glances sideways at his childhood best friend and comments amusedly on how noisy and playful Bart still is. With great enthusiasm, the The young blonde man calls upon the entire crowd to raise their hands and offer a collective prayer for the eternal glory and prosperity of the lands of Wibben before the lighting of the bonfires. But, to the couple's utter shock, Bart drops a bombshell surprise on the stage and demands that the celebrations begin with a passionate kiss ceremony between the young lord and his wife. The two of them freeze completely, their faces turning red with embarrassment, under the watchful eyes of the entire population, who begin to cheer at the crazy idea. Tyria's eyes widened in utter despair, her heart racing as she realized she would have to give a real kiss in front of all the locals. The crowd of farmers huddled around the central square under the beautiful starry sky of that autumn night. The blond man continues to incite the citizens with energy, taking advantage of the immense bonfire that begins to be lit right behind him in the courtyard. He points again towards the noble couple and loudly repeats the call for them to perform the long-awaited celebratory kiss of the festival. Virtually cornered in front of the entire city, Elric and Tyria exchange extremely embarrassed glances and sweat nervously under the pressure from the crowd. Bart winks mischievously, raising his torch and urging his friend to overcome his shyness and kiss his wife already, eliciting mental curses from young Master Portman. Laughing heartily at Elric's obvious embarrassment, the blond man calls on the entire square to sing in chorus to encourage the boy to take the first step. The entire crowd of market vendors and farmers begins to clap and shout in unison for the kiss to finally happen right there in the middle of the courtyard. Realizing they had no way out of there, Elric approached, his face flushed, and politely excused himself from his wife. With a swift and assertive movement, the young man grabs Tyria by the waist and leans her back in a cinematic fashion in the middle of the stone hall. The young noblewoman's eyes widened in complete astonishment as she felt her husband's face draw so intimately and suddenly closer under the light of the flames. The young man apologized quietly, his face burning with shame, explaining that he had to take that bold action so that the crowd would finally stop insisting and bothering them once and for all. Tyria looks at him with extreme sweetness and agrees that she perfectly understands the need for that public display to save face for the couple at the festival. However, contrary to all the boy's expectations, the young woman gently lays her fingers on his face and brings her lips close to his, returning the kiss deeply and passionately under the gaze of everyone. The central square erupts in a veritable frenzy of shouts, applause, and enthusiastic celebrations as they witness the royal display of love between the noble couple. Beautiful fireworks illuminate the starry sky on that magical night, while the residents shout vows of eternal love and glory for the Wibben region. Hours later, the imposing Portman mansion returns to its sepulchral silence beneath the beautiful starry night sky. Inside her private quarters, Tyria throws herself onto the bed and hides her completely red face under the pillow, letting out muffled little cries of pure embarrassment for what she did in the square. She lifts her head breathless and tries everything to calm her racing heart, feeling her face burn with shame as she remembers that warm sensation. The shocking image of herself holding Elric's face and giving him that passionate kiss in front of the whole town replays in her thoughts, leaving her desperate with her own sudden audacity. She tortures herself wondering if her husband will now see her as a strange and shameless woman, unable to fall asleep during that cold autumn morning. Across the hallway, Elric also remained wide awake, lying in bed, staring thoughtfully at the ceiling while caressing his own lips, his face flushed and confused. Meanwhile, far from that peaceful wheat farm, the story transports us to the imposing official residence of the prestigious white family in the Kingdom of Armin. Inside a luxurious hall decorated with golden details, a fair-skinned hand elegantly raises a delicate ornate porcelain cup. He is a young nobleman with glasses and neatly combed blonde hair, calmly savoring his hot tea while reviewing some official war reports. A female officer with long platinum blonde hair approaches her marble desk and solemnly reports that the Imperial Army forces have successfully broken through the defensive lines of the Falban and Chevor borders. She concludes by explaining that since the official resignation and definitive disappearance of the legendary mercenary Kasha, the defenses of that region have been crumbling without any significant resistance. With an extremely cold and Machiavellian smile on his face, the feared Duke of Gold, Edward White, proudly comments that planning Kasha's downfall and removal from the battlefields was his most brilliant masterstroke of all. Beside him, his loyal secretary Agnes Blackmire remains completely silent, attentively observing every expression of her shrewd boss. Agnes breaks her silence to consider that the regions of Falban and Chevor have massive investments from the White Group, questioning whether it would really be prudent to allow these territories to fall into the hands of the Imperial Army. He takes another sip of his tea and calmly explains that this war of conquest has already lasted 7 long years, emphasizing that these borders have only held out until now thanks to Kasha's funds and presence. He adds disdainfully that those bankrupt lands have completely lost any financial capacity to settle the immense debts they owe to the kingdom of Armin. The Duke coldly concludes that, with the demon of the sword's definitive absence, the borders will soon crumble, and that their only task is to rescue the people of interest and collect their shares before the final collapse. Agnes approaches and holds the exquisite golden teapot to solemnly serve more tea to her master. As she pours the hot liquid into his cup, the secretary remarks with a slight tone of respect that the Duke is a truly ruthless and calculating man in business. The boy makes a funny face of fright and comically protests, claiming that he is only fulfilling his strict duty as a responsible and loyal nobleman of the kingdom of Armin. But Agnes quickly shifts the focus of the conversation to a much more troubling subject, questioning whether it would truly be safe and prudent to let the dreaded Kasha live in peace after everything that has happened. Edward gives a very enigmatic, lopsided smile and calmly corrects her, reminding her that he has abandoned that mercenary identity and that now he goes only by the name Elric Portman. The platinum-haired woman simulates shooting herself in the head with her fingers and suggests that perhaps they should have eliminated him at once to avoid any risk of future revenge. But the Duke counters that a mistake at that moment would have caused the warrior to kill him before he even recovered. He recalls with astonishment the day he witnessed Kasha raise his mana shield in a fraction of a second to deflect a supersonic projectile, noting that the legs of that combat monster should have been completely shattered anyway. Edward adds with considerable enthusiasm that it would be a real waste of potential to kill him, stating that the situation ended up unfolding in a much more advantageous way for his plans. He explains in a serious tone that the young man is a mercenary through and through, and that, although they both belong to the same kind of strategists, there is a crucial difference between them. The Duke emphasizes that Elric is a man who never makes decisions or wields his blade for personal financial gain, a trait that is extremely rare for any mercenary fighter. Displaying a malicious expression, he reveals that he has decided to use the young man's noble character to his advantage, subtly keeping him under his absolute control. Now that the sword demon is out of action, Wibben's wheat trade route has become immensely valuable and coveted, with the kingdom of Armin entering the bidding war this year with full force. The secretary intelligently considers that, should the war reach a definitive stalemate, Kasha's mere existence and the weight of his name will serve as leverage to control the global conflict and further enrich the White Group. Hearing that brilliant and surgical analysis makes the ambitious Duke's eyes gleam intensely with pure satisfaction and pride. He stands up excitedly, pointing at Agnes, happily celebrating having such a perceptive and intelligent secretary by his side in business. He walks towards her with open arms, demanding a warm hug to celebrate, but the platinum blonde remains still, her expression utterly icy in the face of his excitement. With a swift and unceremonious blow, Agnes strikes him precisely to stop his abusive advances, causing the young man to choke on his own saliva in pain. While the Duke writhes in pain on the luxurious living room carpet, the platinum blonde coldly warns him not to try anything funny, assuring him that she won't go easy on him just because of his young age. Back at the Portman mansion, the day of the big business trip finally dawns under a clear, bright blue autumn sky. Elric observes his own reflection in the gold-framed mirror wearing his new elegant brown coat, while Rhonda adjusts the shoulders of the garment and carefully asks if the fabric is comfortable. As he turned to leave the room, the young man immediately saw his beautiful wife Tyria coming down the hallway, wearing a lovely and charming reddish travel dress. The young noblewoman stopped abruptly in front of him, her cheeks flushed, completely surprised by her husband's elegant appearance. Elric also gazes at her rather shyly and feels his heart race as he contemplates the sweetness and indescribable beauty of his wife at that moment. Rhonda senses the romantic atmosphere between the couple and playfully steps between them, gesturing cheerfully while striking up a conversation with Tyria to ease the tension. Then, the housekeeper leaves the room with quick, hurried steps, leaving the two young people alone in the mansion's immense hallway. Elric awkwardly rubbed the back of his neck in embarrassment under the watchful and mischievous gaze of Rhonda, who was discreetly watching them from afar. The housekeeper playfully asks if the two have been arguing, commenting in a gossipy tone that she's heard rumors that the atmosphere between them on the night of the Harvest Festival in the town square has been extremely heated. The boy panics with embarrassment and begins gesticulating frantically to deny the gossip, claiming that it was all just Bart's fault and that he had no choice but to act that way in the square. Desperately trying to avoid such an intimate topic for a couple, the young man sweats nervously and quickly asks who the important buyers arriving that day might be. Rhonda resumes her professional role as housekeeper and solemnly reveals that an impressive commercial delegation from the Western Kingdoms is about to land in the city. Upon hearing the mention of the Western Kingdoms, the ex-mercenary's red eyes narrow in a look of extreme tension and silent worry. The housekeeper cheerfully explains that the market value of Wibben wheat is extremely high, attracting buyers from various nations every year, and highlights that this time, even the powerful kingdom of Armen has entered the bidding war. Overcome by silent despair, Elric realizes that this business trip could turn into a real disaster if any of those foreign soldiers recognize the features of the feared mercenary Kasha, attracting dangerous enemies to Wibben. Rhonda comments that, under normal circumstances, Tyria would be responsible for receiving them at the station, but emphasizes that it would be very prudent for Elric to assume his role as leader this time, receiving a rather nervous agreement from the young master. Shortly after, Elric arrives at the busy train station accompanied by Aldio, who tries to reassure him, gently telling the young man not to be too anxious about the business meeting. The old butler assures that simply conducting the formal greetings exactly as he taught him in yesterday's etiquette class will ensure everything goes perfectly well, earning a sincere thank you from his boss. Trying to calm himself somehow, Elric takes a deep breath and repeats to himself that none of the generals or soldiers who faced him on the front lines would have come all this way just to negotiate sacks of wheat. He glances sideways at the small combat dagger strategically hidden in his brown coat, trying to convince himself that this business trip will proceed entirely peacefully. Amidst the deafening noise and a dense cloud of white smoke, the large steam locomotive finally pulls into the station's platform. The doors of the luxury carriages open, and the first foreign representatives and diplomats begin to descend elegantly onto the cobblestone sidewalk. Elric bows politely and officially welcomes the members of the entourage, formally introducing himself as the new leader and lord of the prestigious Portman family. He kindly informs them that he already has comfortable carriages ready at the station exit to transport them safely to his farmland. However, one of the veteran diplomats in the delegation instantly felt a chill run down his spine, letting out a trembling sigh of pure terror as he fixed his gaze on the young man. Upon realizing that the man was staring intently at him, Elric's red eyes gleamed with a cold and utterly menacing intensity. Completely trembling and sweating with utter terror upon recognizing the features of the fearsome warrior from the battlefronts, the pale diplomat stammers, asking if he is indeed the dreaded Kasha. Back at the luxurious palace of the Kingdom of Armen, an authoritative female voice asks in surprise who exactly has just arrived at the official residence. Edward hurried through the imposing corridors alongside Agnes, nervously complaining that his sister hadn't mentioned anything at all about that sudden visit. The young man hurriedly opens the imposing golden doors of the grand reception hall to assess the situation. He opens his arms with a huge smile on his face and shouts his older sister's name, Ygritte. But the reception he receives is an extremely cold, intimidating, and furious look from the powerful noblewoman with long red hair. Seated with her arms crossed on the luxurious sofa, the dreaded flaming flower, Ygritte Valentina, who holds the majority of the shares in the White Group, stares at him with utter disdain. Completely ignoring the tense atmosphere, Edward runs towards her and enthusiastically lifts her into the air, playfully joking that she seems to have grown even more since their last meeting. Consumed by a murderous rage and with fire emanating from her presence, the girl coldly orders him to put her down immediately if he doesn't want to be reduced to ashes right there. The boy freezes in terror and agrees immediately, his eyes rolling nervously, hastily pulling his arms back before she carries out her threat. Ygritte adjusts his dark cloak and gets straight to the point, demanding to know if he has finally discovered Kasha's exact whereabouts, reminding him that he made this request days ago. Scratching the back of his neck nervously, Edward tries to stammer that the legendary mercenary is like an invisible ghost, and that tracking his steps since his retirement from the battlefront has been a Herculean task. Furious at the excuse, the noblewoman grabs him forcefully by the face and shouts angrily, threatening to withdraw all her shares from the trading group if he doesn't fulfill his duty, leaving the Duke desperate and begging for mercy. Squeezing her brother's cheek with relentless force, she demands that if he fears financial ruin so much, he should go after the damned sword demon and at least bring her its exact location as quickly as possible. After giving the stern orders, Ygritte turns abruptly and walks towards the exit, his long dark cloak billowing in the air. She displays a focused and determined expression, concentrated solely on her mysterious personal objective involving the missing warrior. Before crossing the threshold, she warns him in a threatening tone that she won't give him much time and demands that he bring news soon, receiving a downcast reply from her brother. The imposing doors slam shut with a loud bang, bringing that tense and explosive family visit to a definitive end. Fallen to his knees in exhaustion on the floor, Edward hears his secretary ask if he will really give Kasha's location to his sister, and the young man replies, terrified, that he would never do that, knowing the global disaster that would occur if those two combat monsters crossed paths. Trying to focus on what really matters, the Duke adjusts his glasses and quickly asks if the important trading delegation has already begun its journey towards the lands of Wibben. Agnes confirms the departure and considers that, if the Duke's suspicions are correct, she highly doubts that a warrior as proud as the mercenary Kasha would take such a simple commercial bait thrown by them. With an extremely malicious smile on his face, Edward retorts that Elric Portman is no fool and will have no choice but to close the wheat deal, since he has prepared a simply irresistible business proposal for the family. The story takes us back to the tracks of Wibben Station, where the imposing steam train travels, cutting through the beautiful autumnal landscape. Inside one of the luxury passenger carriages, the feared Lord Polo and another influential diplomat travel in complete silence, immersed in tense thoughts about the fate of that important business trip. The silence of the luxurious travel compartment is broken only by the rhythmic rattling of the train's metal rails as it journeys to its destination. The other diplomat, with gray hair, maintained an expression of extreme seriousness and concentration, focused solely on ensuring the success of the upcoming negotiations. The train finally pulls up to the Wibben platform under a dense cloud of white steam smoke. The doors open, and the diplomats begin to descend elegantly onto the cobblestone sidewalk of the city's bustling station. Elric approaches with impeccable posture and formally welcomes the diplomats, officially introducing himself as the new lord and head of the Portman family. He kindly informs them that he has already arranged for carriages to transport them safely to the mansion, but interrupts himself upon noticing the sudden astonishment of one of the visitors. Lord Polo froze in utter terror and let out a trembling sigh, immediately recognizing the striking features of the young man standing right there in front of him. Upon realizing that the man was staring at him with such despair, Elric's eyes glowed an extremely cold and menacing shade of red. The diplomat sweated profusely and recoiled in fear, his pale face trembling as he wondered if the elegant man before him was indeed the dreaded sword demon. Lord Polo clutched his chest in panic and began shouting desperately, drawing the attention of all the other diplomats, who asked, confused, if he had gotten sick from the train food, while Elric internally cursed himself for having run into that man right there. The young man realizes that if his true identity as a mercenary is revealed to everyone, the peace of the Wibben lands will be in grave danger, and decides that he must hide who he really is at all costs. The hysterical diplomat begins yelling, demanding an immediate return to the train and ordering them to turn the vehicle around under the astonished gaze of his fellow travelers. Elric forces a very friendly smile to diffuse the situation, formally introducing himself aloud simply as Elric Portman, heir and lord of the Portman house. Hearing that name makes Lord Polo blink in confusion and freeze for a few moments, his heart racing as he wonders if the young man might actually be the dreaded assassin from the war. The young master approaches sympathetically, extending his hand to help him, commenting in a good-humored tone that he looks terribly pale, which makes the diplomat begin to believe that this docile and smiling boy could never be the ruthless sword demon of his nightmares. After all, the terrifying mental image he held of Kasha from his last battle memory 5 years ago was infinitely different from that of an ordinary cane-wielding nobleman. At that time, the dreaded sword demon delivered a brutal and merciless slap to the face of an aristocrat in the middle of a lavish military reception. The man who had been struck was thrown a considerable distance and landed awkwardly on the stone floor under the completely shocked gaze of all the noble guests present in the hall. Dozens of aristocrats began whispering in horror at such boundless insolence committed by a mere mercenary against the imperial court. Lying on the stone floor and publicly humiliated, the nobleman raged furiously, asking how a plebeian worm of insignificant origin dared to raise a hand against someone of such important lineage. Without showing the slightest concern for the man's hysterical screams, Kasha simply removed his leather gloves with a look of utter disdain and disgust on his chest. With extreme coldness, and without offering unnecessary arguments, the mercenary threw his glove directly at his opponent's face in a sign of profound contempt. He positioned himself majestically and openly demanded that this offense against his personal honor be resolved immediately through a life-or-death duel right there. The aristocrat accepted the challenge with shouts of fury, hysterically ordering his personal guards to bring 2 swords to teach that insolent brat a definitive lesson in etiquette. But the start of the fight was suddenly interrupted by the hurried arrival of Elvis Graham in his wheelchair, shouting for everyone to stop this madness immediately. Kasha glanced over his shoulder with a look of profound boredom and impatience at his former employer's intrusion into the salon. Elvis Graham bowed in apology and pleaded with Lord Polo to forgive his fellow mercenary's insolence with noble magnanimity, trying at all costs to calm the aristocrat's fury before things got worse. Back in the flashback, the nobleman rages furiously that even though that fellow was a companion of Elvis Graham, it was an unforgivable offense, while Elvis himself desperately orders Kasha to lower her head and apologize to Lord Polo right then and there. At that time, Lord Polo swallowed hard as he finally associated the name Kasha with the dreaded sword demon, a warrior whose name should never be uttered, much less crossed in a tone of enmity on the battlefield. He recalls with horror that the mercenary he witnessed that day in the royal hall was a creature of pure coldness and bloodlust. Back in the present, Lord Polo lets out a sigh of relief and tries to compose himself, stammering that he probably only got carried away by mistake and asking young Lord Elric Portman to forget that misunderstanding so they can proceed with the business meeting. Even while trying to maintain his composure at the train station, the diplomat continued to sweat inside, cursing in his thoughts the mere memory of that damned mercenary who insisted on haunting him. Elric watches him sideways with a look of extreme coldness and silent determination, making sure to maintain the disguise of his true identity. The carriage carrying the entourage finally sets off towards the manor house, cutting through the dirt road under the beautiful reddish sky of dusk. As they approach the imposing Portman estate, the coachman informs all the passengers that they will arrive shortly and asks them to prepare to disembark from the vehicle. In the main courtyard of the mansion, Tyria awaited the entourage with all her innate elegance, alongside her maids, to formally welcome the visitors. Introducing herself sweetly as Tyria Portman, the beautiful blonde declares that it is a great honor to receive such important representatives from the western kingdoms in her lands. She notices their obvious tiredness from the long journey and suggests with extreme kindness that the best thing to do at the moment would be for them to retire to their guest rooms to rest. The young noblewoman then orders the governess Rhonda to guide the foreign diplomats to the accommodations meticulously prepared by the staff of maids. Hours later, Under the silence of the starry courtyard of the Portman mansion, light, rhythmic knocks beat on the door of one of the guest rooms. Seated comfortably in his armchair, the portly Lord Polo grumbles irritably at the late interruption, wondering if it's some kind of room service offered by the servants. Firm, rhythmic footsteps begin to echo across the bedroom carpet, leaving the visitor quite intrigued by the newcomer's presence. He turns sharply to tell the employee to leave, but his voice dies in his throat when he comes face to face with young Lord Portman himself, entering silently into the room. With a cold look and eyes gleaming bright red in the dim light, Elric closes the bedroom door and coldly announces that he does indeed need to disturb Lord Polo that night. The sudden fright and the boy's overwhelming aura cause the diplomat to lose his balance at once, falling awkwardly backward onto the bedroom carpet. Trembling with terror and pointing with sweaty hands, he screams in despair upon recognizing that murderous look and confirming that the young man is indeed the dreaded Kasha. The man's hysterical screams echoed muffledly through the mansion windows, repeating in a panicked tone that he was absolutely certain that the Portman heir was the ruthless sword demon. Maintaining absolute composure, the young man with the cane looks down at him and coldly admits that, since the secret has been fully exposed between them, he will no longer bother to hide his true identity. Lord Polo tries to crawl backwards across the floor in sheer fear, begging for his life and desperately arguing that he has already sincerely apologized for the incident that occurred at the royal palace. Elric settles elegantly into the empty armchair and asks sarcastically if he's referring specifically to the day he gravely insulted his family name and his own pride. The boy stares at him with an extremely stern look and coldly recalls that in his memories of that day, he never actually declared that he accepted the apologies offered. The diplomat is still huddled on the floor, sweating with panic, until Elric asks if he intends to stay there and suggests he settle into the chair opposite so they can finally discuss private wheat business. In a firm tone, the Portman heir questions whether the true purpose of his long business trip to Wibbin's lands wasn't precisely to purchase his crops. Still visibly trembling and frightened, the diplomat finally decides to get up and settle into the armchair on the opposite side of the coffee table. Lord Polo stared at him apprehensively and swallowed hard, anxiously waiting to see what kind of demand the young man would make of him. Elric begins the negotiation coldly and reveals that, before their meeting that night, he had a very productive business meeting with the influential Lord Ugil. The diplomat jumps from his chair in surprise upon hearing that name and stammers, asking what the competitor said, receiving a calm reply from Elric, revealing that the man made an offer he couldn't refuse for the land. The young man with the cane calmly confirms Polo's suspicions, leaving the diplomat even more tense at the table. He calmly explains that all the wheat from Wibbin acquired by the Kingdom of Armin would be strategically distributed throughout the western region of the continent of Mahidoro. Young Master Portman concludes by saying that a considerable portion of the commission fees generated during this distribution process would be paid directly to his family. Polo seriously emphasizes that the sole and strict condition of that lucrative agreement was that the Portmans sell all the stock exclusively to the Kingdom of Armin. He gazes intently at the heir and assures him that he fully trusts the young man will make a very wise and prudent decision as the new leader and master of that immense estate. The diplomat displays a rather shrewd, sly smile as he seals his formal proposal by addressing him by his last name, Portman. Back in the guest room, Lord Polo slams both hands on the wooden table in utter fury, cursing indignantly at the audacity of the Kingdom of Armin in betraying them. He screams, his face red with rage at having been betrayed in that way behind the scenes, and swears revenge against Lord Ugil, calling him a venomous snake for secretly negotiating with Elric. Taking advantage of the diplomat's obvious fury, Elric calmly suggests that the two of them make an exclusivity agreement, leaving the man surprised and speechless by the sudden proposal. With a focused and sharp gaze, the young master confirms that he agrees to sell all his wheat production to the Empire, provided that the price offered exactly matches the value proposed by Armin. The diplomat hesitates and argues tensely that despite being the Empire's official supply officer, He would never have the legal authority to approve such a large sum on his own without the approval of his superiors. Elric plays his last and most powerful card, suggesting that closing that business deal would serve as compensation for him to finally accept the apologies for the slapping incident and forget the past resentment. Lord Polo sweated nervously as he realized that refusing the trade deal could mean his own physical ruin at the hands of the dreaded sword demon. He stammers, trying to bargain for a price reduction to 60% of the amount proposed by Armin, but the young Master Portman coldly retorts that such a drastic cut in profits would be unacceptable for his family's business. The portly diplomat squints thoughtfully, his cold sweat nervous, trapped between financial demands and the real fear of incurring Kasha's wrath. He then puts a new proposal on the table, offering 70% of the value, and promises that the Empire will fully cover all transportation costs and customs duties for Wibben. Elric analyzes the counter-proposal with a shrewd sidelong glance and counters by demanding 75% under the exact same freight and tax exemption conditions mentioned before. With no other viable alternative to save his own life and his family's prestige, Lord Polo seals the final agreement with a firm, yet very tense, handshake. The young master celebrates the success of that extremely advantageous transaction, ironically congratulating the diplomat for having conducted such a daring negotiation against the Empire itself that night. However, before leaving the guest room, the portly diplomat stares at him intrigued and curiously questions why, of all the influential people in the West, Kasha chose to negotiate with him, of all people. In truth, Elric thought to himself that he chose to negotiate with Lord Polo simply because he seemed the easiest target of all to manipulate. Of course, the young master kept this provocation to himself, saying aloud only that this reunion would be an excellent opportunity for them to finally resolve past issues. Taking advantage of the moment of agreement, Elric announces that he would like to make one last important request to the diplomat. Polo listens attentively, but freezes immediately when the boy warns about what would happen if rumors surfaced that the dreaded Kasha had been sighted in the Wibben region. With a grim look and eyes gleaming red, the former mercenary makes it clear that if his secret is leaked, their trading contract will be rewritten in blood. The portly diplomat nodded frantically, trembling with sheer terror at the direct threat of death. The following day, all the sales representatives gather around the large meeting table in the Portman mansion to formalize the deal. Tyria rises very elegantly before everyone and formally announces that the Portman family will finalize the exclusive commercial agreement with the Imperial Army. Elric watches the announcement with a satisfied smile, proudly applauding his wife's excellent leadership. While everyone around celebrates the decision, the other diplomat congratulates Lord Polo on the great victory in the wheat negotiations. But suddenly, a violent slap hits the wooden table in the meeting room, shattering the friendly atmosphere that had been building. Edmund Ugil shouts angrily, asking if Tyria hasn't heard anything about her husband's previous terms. But the young woman calmly replies that everything is proceeding exactly according to the wishes of the master of the house. The Imperial envoy indignantly asks if she realizes how absurd the transaction is, but the blonde coldly interrupts him, demanding to be addressed by the title, Mrs. Portman. Edmund Ugil is completely speechless at the young woman's unexpected firmness. Under Elric's surprised gaze, she stands proudly and declares loudly that she is Tyria Portman, the rightful wife of the lord beside her. With an extremely sharp look, she adds that insisting on the incorrect title is a tremendous lack of courtesy coming from an official representative, pronouncing Edmund Ugil's full name. Feeling utterly humiliated in front of everyone, the diplomat swallows his pride and awkwardly apologizes to Mrs. Portman. Lord Polo couldn't contain himself and let out a muffled laugh at the stunned expression on his defeated competitor's face. Elric lets out a long sigh of relief and smiles, clearly pleased with how the situation has turned out. The young man gripped the handle of his cane tightly, feeling that his duty for the day had been accomplished with absolute success behind the scenes at the mansion. Once outside the mansion, Elric orders the coachman to escort the visitors safely back to the city's train station. From inside the carriage, Lord Polo nods knowingly while firmly holding the precious signed contract document. Elric responds with a very focused nod, pleased to have ensured the safety and prosperity of his lands. The couple then stood side by side, watching the vehicle speed away down the beautiful road surrounded by golden fields. The young man gazes at his wife with admiration and comments with a sincere smile that he has begun to see her in a new light after witnessing her firm and decisive demeanor at the meeting. Tyria looks away, blushing slightly, and replies very sweetly that she only spoke the absolute truth in front of everyone. She finishes by saying in a playful tone that her husband also proved to be an extremely astute negotiator, leaving the young man quite surprised by the sudden compliment. Holding the paperwork of the agreement with glee, she reveals that Lord Polo has already given her the contract, and that she noticed their real profits were infinitely greater than the publicly advertised terms. Somewhat awkwardly, Elric explains that he found Armin's envoy too arrogant, and only wanted to teach him a lesson in humility, hurting his wounded pride, receiving full support from his wife. Tyria then affectionately suggests that they finally go inside the house to rest, and the young man readily agrees, slowly accompanying her back home. While peace reigns in Wibben, an imposing golden flag bearing the initials of the influential White family flutters gently under the sky. The scene shifts to the luxurious and gigantic official private residence of the powerful White business group. Outside the large golden doors of the main office, a scandalous and desperate cry of pure revolt can be heard. Edward bursts into the immense hall, desperately running with his hands on his head, screaming at the top of his lungs, unable to understand what went wrong with his plans. The boy cries in frustration, complaining that he offered to buy all the wheat for an excellent price and even share the distribution profits, without understanding why Elric refused his perfect offer. He rants that all Elric needed to do was sit back, collect the profits, and act exactly as planned, while Agnes tries in vain to get her boss to calm down a bit. In a completely dramatic fashion, the Duke throws himself face first onto the carpet, crying and complaining that the Portman heir deliberately ruined his entire brilliant strategy just to satisfy himself. But amidst all that exaggerated acting, the young man's foot actually slips on the smooth office floor. Edward completely loses his balance and begins to plummet backward toward the marble floor. But before it hits the ground, a firm, quick hand grabs its wrist in the last millisecond. The blond man's eyes widened in surprise as he realized he had been saved from that nasty fall that would surely have hurt his face. Agnes heroically and effortlessly holds him directly against her chest, saving her boss from the domestic accident. The platinum blonde remains motionless in the same imposing rescue pose, carrying the boy in her arms without making the slightest physical effort. She reprimands him quite firmly, asking if he has finally learned to calm down, and the boy apologizes very quietly and embarrassed for his childish behavior. Moments later, a delicious hot tea is delicately served in an exquisite decorated porcelain cup. Agnes stares at him, standing there, and asks if he feels a little calmer now, receiving a gentle thank you from the young man as he savors his hot drink. Edward adjusts his glasses thoughtfully and comments that, remembering his time as Kasha, he was certain the young man would never do direct business with the Empire, admitting that the heir had completely shattered his expectations. The secretary observes him seriously and very wisely suggests that, when one wants to discover a man's true intentions, the most correct thing to do would be to ask him directly. She concludes by saying that he will likely have no other viable choice but to pay a personal visit to Elric Portman to get his answers face to face. Determined to resolve this impasse once and for all, the young Duke reaches out to open one of the drawers in his personal office. Faced with this intriguing situation, Edward adjusts his glasses and makes a bold decision to finally solve the mystery behind Elric's behavior. Opening his desk drawer, he gazes at a richly ornamented gold revolver and remarks that they will certainly need a rather persuasive conversational tool for that meeting. The scene shifts to the imposing and exquisite official residence of the influential Elvis Graham. Lord Polo enters the luxurious office and hands a roll of parchment to Elvis Graham, who greets it warmly in his wheelchair after a long time, without seeing each other in person. Intrigued by the visitor's urgency, the platinum-haired nobleman unties the cord of the document and asks what the mysterious message is about. Polo formally explains that it is a letter sent directly by Elric Portman, leaving the platinum-haired man quite thoughtful upon hearing that familiar name. He unfolds the yellowed paper with his gloved hands and begins to carefully examine the handwriting of his former comrade in arms. The fair-haired boy reads the words in absolute silence, maintaining an extremely focused expression throughout the entire reading. But suddenly, he can't contain his spontaneous reaction and lets out a loud laugh, taking the fat diplomat completely by surprise. Elvis burst into laughter, covering his face with his white glove, finding the whole situation with his old battle buddy incredibly funny and comical. He jokingly remarks that he never expected to hear his war partner's civilian name and quips that Polo must have nearly fainted from fright when he came face to face with the dreaded Kasha, receiving a trembling agreement from the man. Laughing heartily, the nobleman sincerely thanks the visitor for delivering such valuable correspondence directly to him. Satisfied with having completed his mission, Lord Polo bids him a hurried farewell, requesting not to be accompanied to the exit, and Elvis wishes him an excellent and safe journey home. Alone in his office, Elvis smiles fondly as he thinks about how his friend disappeared into thin air to live in the peaceful lands of Wibben, reflecting that winter must already be approaching in that region. Meanwhile, the loud sound of a gunshot echoes shrilly down a snow-covered path in the Wibben fields. White smoke begins to rise slowly from the barrel of a hunting rifle recently fired in the middle of the frozen forest. A young local hunter excitedly celebrates with his companions after hitting his prey squarely among the trees in the snow. They run joyfully toward a deer lying on the frozen ground, celebrating that this great catch would finally free them from the level of novice hunters. While two of them discuss whether they should bring the horses to carry the animal's weight, the group's leader stops abruptly, feeling a terrible chill down his spine. His companions call out to him, urging him to bring the horses at once, but Derek remains paralyzed and trembling with sheer nervousness in the face of imminent danger. With his cheeks flushed from the cold and tension, the boy makes a gesture of absolute silence with his finger to his friends. Derek raises his hunting rifle tremulously and whispers, ordering the two to immediately move away from the fallen prey, leaving them completely confused by his reaction. He stammers, frightened, stating that he can feel an extremely cold energy in the air, warning that a terrible magical beast must be prowling that frozen forest. The companion scoffs at the warning and laughs, saying it's utter nonsense, mocking that the cold is only because it's winter, and ordering him to fetch the horses at once to carry the deer. But the discussion is suddenly interrupted when a gigantic, sharp claw smashes the snow-covered ground right in front of them with a terrifying impact. Desperate at the monster's appearance, Derek points his rifle toward the danger and yells for his friends to get out of the way immediately. A colossal silhouette of a terrifying wolf emerges from the shadows, hovering directly above the young hunters who scream in sheer terror. Before them stood a beast with blue fur and gleaming cyan eyes, growling menacingly in the clearing. Shortly after, the story takes us back to the imposing Portman mansion under a winter sky heavy with gray clouds. Inside the living room, Tyria listens to the survivor's account with an expression of deep concern and melancholy on her beautiful face. The young hunters appear bruised and dejected before her, sadly confessing that they fled in utter panic under the snow to save their lives from the beast's attack. Demonstrating immense empathy, the young woman thanks everyone for their efforts and assures them that she will speak personally with Elric to resolve the terrible situation of danger that plagues the lands. She then turns and gently orders Rhonda to provide hearty meals and hot drinks to comfort those wounded hunters. Immediately afterwards, the faithful butler Aldio retrieves a heavy, old book about magical creatures and beasts of the region from one of the shelves. As they walk through the mansion's immense library, the elderly butler leafs through the document and says that, based on the testimonies collected, the answers about the monster are close. He adjusts his monocle and reveals seriously that the beast spotted by the hunters in the forest is a dangerous blade wolf. Worried, the young woman asks if it really is a magical beast, and the butler confirms, explaining that species had disappeared from Wibben since its former alpha leader was hunted down. Aldio makes a point of reminding everyone that it was precisely that former leader of the monsters who caused the deep scar that young Master Elric has carried on his neck since childhood, receiving a sad nod from his mistress. It is at this moment that a flame of profound determination and firmness begins to silently ignite in Tyria's chest. With her bright yellow eyes gleaming, she decrees that she will not allow any citizen of her lands to suffer the same danger her husband faced in the past, announcing that she will immediately organize an elite hunting party. The elderly butler bows respectfully and assures him that he will begin the search and recruitment of the most experienced warriors in the region for the hunting mission. However, before he leaves the library, his mistress calls him back, quite seriously, to give him one last important instruction. Tyria places her index finger to her lips and asks with extreme delicacy that the entire hunting operation be kept in absolute secrecy from her husband. The butler hesitates, intrigued for a brief moment, but accepts the order and promises to keep young Master Elric completely unaware of that dangerous investigation in the forest. In the snow-covered outer courtyard, the portman's elegant official carriage was already fully prepared for a new journey. Elric gazes sweetly at his beautiful wife and announces with a friendly smile that he will return from his bureaucratic business soon, receiving a tender wish for a good trip from her. The couple bids a tender farewell, and the vehicle departs at a steady speed along the cold road under the watchful eyes of Tyria and Aldio in the mansion's courtyard. The butler worriedly questioned whether omitting the truth would hurt his employer's feelings, but the young woman clarified that if Elric had known the danger, he would surely have insisted on fighting alone, completely ignoring his serious leg injury. She looks away thoughtfully, fondly remembering when he had acted in exactly that same protective way in the past. The memory of that day when she desperately cried out her little hero's name in the middle of the forest resurfaces in a very moving way in her heart. Back then, little Elric wielded only a piece of wood to confront the giant wolf and protect the defenseless girl beneath the trees. Back in reality, Tyria firmly states that she will not allow her husband to be in danger again, questioning the butler as to whether the requested preparations are fully complete. Aldio confirms this and proudly introduces the experienced group of elite hunters he personally recruited from within the property's grounds. Satisfied with the number of people, the young woman begins to walk towards the exit, leaving the butler in complete shock as he realizes that his mistress plans to personally accompany the hunting party into the forest. She explains with conviction that, as a noblewoman by birth, her moral duty is to march alongside the men who are risking their lives under the direct orders of her family. Faced with such determination and having no other choice, the butler accepts the decision, but firmly demands that she retreat at the slightest sign of the magical wolf's appearance. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the bustling, cold, snow-covered streets of the Wibben shopping district. Amidst the local commerce, a pensive sigh echoes from within the city's old hospital. The doctor carefully examines Elric's leg and smiles with relief, revealing that the recovery of his injured knee is progressing excellently. Excited by the good news, the young man asks if he can stop using his walking stick, but the doctor advises him to remain cautious for a few more days. The elderly doctor stares at the striking scar on the young master's neck, and curiously wonders if that old childhood wound has left any lasting effects or lingering pain. Elric gives a friendly smile and replies humorously that the recovery was a success, simply because the professional who treated him at the time was the best doctor in Wibben. The doctor thoughtfully recalls the immense difficulties of that treatment, complicated by the cold wolf venom, revealing that Elric's deceased father desperately pleaded with him to save his only son's life. Upon hearing that unexpected revelation, Elric is in utter shock, unable to believe that his stern father would have shown such despair and love for him. The doctor added with a smile that he had never in his life seen the expression on the face of the dreaded Hoven portman become so pale and terrified with pure fear of losing his son. The boy stares, thoughtfully at the ground, feeling a knot forming in his chest as he tries to reconcile the image of his cold and calculating father with that of a man desperate to save him. The doctor bids a friendly farewell at the entrance to the office, reiterating his request that the young professor avoid any unnecessary physical exertion in the coming days. The large wooden door slams shut with a dull thud, leaving the young man's mind filled with confused thoughts about the past. Elric walks slowly down the frozen street with the aid of his cane, unaware of the cloaked man waiting for him ahead. Suddenly, a familiar voice calls him by his full given name, making the boy turn around startled in his tracks, focusing his gaze on the newcomer. A broad smile of surprise spreads across the young master's face as he recognizes his old friend Luton. The warrior smiles happily and celebrates the fact that his former combat captain has finally returned to the peaceful region of Wibin. The two friends embrace warmly in much celebration, with Luton revealing that he ran as fast as he could as soon as he received the letter sent by his friend. Elric mentions that he heard rumors that his partner had joined the prestigious Royal Knights, and Luton proudly displays the beautiful sword he received directly from the imperial court. The knight suggests they escape the cold and find a good tavern to discuss war stories, and Elric readily agrees, promising to pay for the first round of drinks. But the friendly stroll is suddenly interrupted when an exhausted messenger appears, running and shouting, delivering an urgent letter to Luton, complaining about having his day off ruined. Trembling and sweating profusely from exhaustion, the soldier desperately reveals that the letter is an urgent plea for help sent directly by the Portman family. Hearing his own family name makes Elric's eyes widen in utter shock, demanding to know the meaning of that emergency rescue immediately. The messenger swallows hard and explains with dread that the young lady Tyria Portman has become involved in a terrible mishap in the snow. He concludes by revealing that the master's young wife was cornered and attacked by a magical beast in the Bow forest, causing Elric's murderous rage to awaken in that very second. Far away, the shrill echo of rhythmic gunfire cuts through the silence of the immense, icy frozen forest of the Wibin Mountains. Two monstrous beasts with blue fur and glowing eyes race at high speed through the deep snow toward the combat party. An experienced hunter takes a firm stance and fires a precise rifle shot at one of the approaching wolves. The projectile strikes the monster squarely in the forehead, causing it to let out a yelp of pain as it tumbles awkwardly onto the frozen ground. While the elite hunters exchange intense gunfire to contain the pack's advance, Marie pulls her boss by the arm, begging her to run for urgent shelter. Amidst the despair and falling snow, the young maid spots an old, abandoned wooden cabin among the trees and points hopefully towards it. They run as fast as they can and rush into the cabin to protect themselves from the cold and the imminent attack of the beasts. Outside, the hunter's leader raises a shining magic stone and loudly orders everyone to activate their light stones immediately for the strategy. He explains that the powerful mana released by the glowing stones will serve perfectly as bait to attract and distract the monsters away from the women's shelter. The plan works, and the entire pack of blue wolves begins to fiercely pursue the hunters through the frozen forest, leaving the cabin temporarily safe. Inside the dark and silent cottage, Tyria and Marie remain huddled together, shivering with cold beneath thick travel blankets. Overcome with guilt, the young noblewoman sincerely apologizes for dragging the maid into mortal danger. But Marie gently replies that she insisted on accompanying her of her own free will. The faithful maid tries to comfort her mistress, assuring her that the rescue request has already been sent and that the rescue team will arrive shortly. Tyria smiles gently and confesses that, despite everything, she feels she made the right decision in hiding the hunt from Elric, and is immensely relieved not to put her husband in danger again. Hearing that display of pure love and concern brings tears of deep emotion and respect for her employer to young Marie's eyes. Meanwhile, cutting through the snowstorm with quick steps and swift gallops, Elric and Luton ride desperately towards the forest. The young man stares at the frozen horizon, his chest tight with agony, bitterly wondering why his wife decided to take such a risk alone and questioning whether he is truly so unreliable to her. Luton shouts amidst the strong wind, imploring his friend to try to remain calm in that moment of despair, swearing on his own honor as a royal knight that he will save Tyria's life no matter what. Elric glances at him over his shoulder, his expression a little more serene, and quietly thanks his great battle partner for his sincere loyalty and support. In that poignant childhood memory, little Luton ran desperately under the trees, calling out the name of his great friend. Back then, little Elric wielded only a piece of wood to confront the giant wolf and protect the defenseless girl beneath the trees. The little boy cried in despair and apologized to his friend as he ran in search of urgent help to confront the magical beast. Cutting through the blizzard on his horse, Luton solemnly vows to himself that he will never again leave his beloved captain to fight alone on the battlefield. Just ahead, in the middle of the frozen forest, one of the elite hunters spots them approaching and shouts, waving to guide the riders. Elric leaps from his mount without hesitating for another second and runs desperately to meet the soldier to get news of his wife. The boy firmly gripped the man's shoulders and demanded to know if Tyria was all right, receiving the relieved reply that she had managed to find shelter in an old hut nearby. However, the hunter sadly recounts that his companions ended up completely isolated in the forest after acting as bait to lure the wolf pack away from the cabin. Elric takes a deep breath and orders the soldier to guide him immediately to the location so that he himself can rescue the men. But a firm hand lands on his shoulder, with Luton stopping his friend halfway forward. The knight warns that he himself will take charge of saving the lost hunters, ordering Elric to run immediately to find his wife. He gives an extremely confident smile and asks the captain to trust in his strength, assuring him that he is no longer that cowardly little boy from the past. With a proud smile, Elric agrees to the plan and acknowledges that his friend has indeed become a true and honorable royal knight. Without wasting any more time, Luton draws his sword and runs towards the danger, accompanied by the hunter, to begin the rescue. Elric watches them leave for a brief moment, repeating to himself that he needs to run as fast as possible to protect his true love. The boy moves forward with quick and determined steps through the relentless blizzard that batters the forest. Each of Elric's footsteps sinks deep into the white carpet of ice, but he completely ignores the physical fatigue. Shielding his eyes from the icy wind with his arm, he curses, worried about the number of monsters in the area, and desperately hopes everyone is all right. Suddenly, the ex-mercenary's red eyes widen as he spots the old wooden cabin structure just ahead. With a swift and confident movement, he flung open the cabin door in one swift motion, even against the strong wind. Breathless and with a heavy heart, the young man shouts at the top of his lungs the name of his beloved wife inside the dark shelter. The two women jump in fright at the sudden entrance, and Tyria, trembling and blushing with embarrassment, asks what her husband is doing there in the snowstorm. Without uttering a single word immediately, the young man walks with long rhythmic strides towards his wife. With an extremely warm and tight hug, Elric wraps her in his arms under the blanket, leaving even little Marie feeling awkward in the corner of the shelter. Her face flushed with embarrassment and surprise, the young noblewoman, her heart racing, asked why he had come all this way to find her. The boy tightened his embrace even more against Tyria's body, trembling with pure relief at finding her safe and sound in the middle of the cabin. Holding her firmly by the shoulders, he exclaims worriedly, asking why she took such a dangerous action without even consulting him beforehand. Tyria looks away, her eyes brimming with tears, and confesses softly that she did all that simply because she couldn't bear to see her husband in danger because of her again. Hearing that softens Elric's expression, and he sweetly asks if she truly has so little faith in her mate's strength. The young woman tries to justify herself, stammering with embarrassment, but is suddenly interrupted when the young man pulls her into a tender embrace again. He whispers tenderly that he is immensely grateful to see her safe, but pleads with a heavy heart for her to promise never to put herself at risk alone again. Tyria closes her eyes in happiness and rests her face against her husband's chest, sweetly promising to fulfill his wish. In the corner of the cabin, little Marie watches the beautiful reconciliation of the couple with a huge, very sweet smile of satisfaction on her face. But the romantic mood is broken in the same second when heavy, menacing footsteps begin to echo from outside the wooden shelter. Marie runs to the entrance, very excited, joyfully celebrating the fact that the hunters had finally returned to rescue them. The warriors enter the hut under Elric's relieved gaze, who congratulates them with a sincere smile on their excellent work containing the beasts. But the ex-mercenary's cheerful expression changes drastically in the same second when he focuses his gaze on a very worrying detail in the room. He stands up and immediately asks where his partner Luton is, leaving all the elite hunters in absolute and tense silence. One of the hunters trembled as he confessed that Luton had ordered everyone to retreat immediately while he remained alone to face the entire pack of blue wolves at once. Elric puts his hand to his forehead in extreme frustration and anger, mentally cursing his blonde friend for acting so stupidly and impulsively on the battlefield. The young man takes command and firmly orders the hunters to escort his wife and maid safely down the mountain, resolutely announcing that he will return to save Luton. But the instant he turns to leave the cabin, a delicate hand grips the sleeve of his dark suit with extreme firmness. The young master glances over his shoulder, intrigued, noticing the obvious despair on his wife's face. With tears of pure terror in her eyes, Tyria begs from the bottom of her heart for her husband to promise to return safe and sound from that terrible frozen forest. She clutched the fabric of Elric's clothes with trembling hands, showing all her distress at his imminent departure. The young woman trembles as she repeats that the only thing that truly matters in her heart is the physical well-being of her beloved companion. Elric gently takes her hands in his and asks her in a soft voice to fully trust in the strength of her lord. He gives a very charming smile and solemnly promises that he will bring Luton back and return to her arms without a single scratch. Comforted by his words, the young noblewoman gently and deliberately loosens the sleeve of her husband's suit jacket. She stares at him seriously and warns him, her cheeks flushed, that if he breaks that promise of safety, she will never forgive him for the rest of his life. The boy flashes a gentle smile and accepts the challenge willingly, bidding farewell with a confident wave before setting off for good to fight in the blizzard. One of the blue-furred beasts charges forward at high speed, leaping fiercely across the snowfield toward its opponent. Luton stands firmly on his stance, sword in hand, preparing to fend off the wolf's attack as it leaps toward him. With a swift and precise movement of his blade, the royal knight mercilessly cuts the monster in half. Covered in the blood of his enemies and breathing with extreme difficulty, the warrior tries everything to catch his breath amidst the blizzard battle. But the snowstorm hides an even greater threat, revealing an entire pack of hungry blue wolves that begins to surround him from all sides. The boy lets out a wry laugh at his own despair, admitting that he never imagined facing so many magical beasts at once in the frozen forest. His vision begins to blur considerably due to extreme fatigue and the significant blood loss from his deep wounds. Surrounded by the relentless pack in the winter wind, he realizes with anguish that he is about to lose consciousness in the middle of the snowfield. Fallen to his knees and too weak to react, the warrior screams at the top of his lungs, consoling himself with the fact that at least he would have the honor of dying in his own native lands of Wibben. However, he notices with surprise that the wolves have abruptly stopped advancing. Even though he knows he no longer has the strength to lift his combat blade, the pack leader growls menacingly right in front of the boy lying in the frozen snow. The beast finally leaps, its sharp fangs bared, to deliver the coup de grace and end the fight once and for all. Luton simply closes his eyes in resignation, preparing to accept his sad and tragic fate of death beneath the blizzard. But a deafening gunshot cuts through the air in the last millisecond, piercing the wolf's head, which collapses lifeless before his face. The boy opens his eyes in utter shock, wiping the blood from his face and wondering in confusion if the hunters had returned to save him. To his utter astonishment, it is Elric who emerges in a suit from the storm, brandishing a smoking rifle, jokingly remarking that his friend looks terrible for a royal knight. The young master calmly walks towards him, analyzing the destructive power of the firearm, reassuring his wounded friend that Tyria is now completely safe. But the boy quickly changes the tone of the conversation and warns that he will need a big favor from his childhood friend to end that fight in the forest. He points seriously directly to the beautiful and gleaming Imperial Knight's sword that Luton was holding in his hands. With the entire pack beginning to surround them again, Elric calmly asked if he could borrow the blade for a moment. The wounded warrior extends his weapon without hesitation, declaring emotionally that he would even give his own life if his former captain asked him to. but he warns anxiously that this is a genuine imperial royal sword, noting that it is incredibly heavy and completely different from the wooden training swords of their childhood. Ignoring the warning, Elric wields the imperial blade with only one hand and spins it majestically in the air, creating an overwhelming wave of blue mana under the astonished gaze of his friend. He stares coldly at the frozen horizon and remarks that he knows how curious his partner has always been to find out what he's been doing during his decade-long absence from the war. With a rather enigmatic smirk, the boy steps towards the growling wolves and authoritatively announces that he will finally reveal the whole truth to his friend. The magical beasts are enraged by the boy's audacity and prepare to leap all together against their new adversary in the snow. Channeling an absurd amount of brilliant blue mana into his free hand, Elric mockingly comments on the famous magical sensitivity of those blue wolves. The sudden release of such overwhelming energy causes the entire pack to recoil in terror in the middle of the frozen yard. Wielding the gleaming blade with utter mastery, the legendary sword demon charges head-on against the contingent of monsters in the clearing. With a swift, almost invisible movement, he begins a veritable dance of death amidst the Wibben snowstorm. He cuts through the air, delivering precise and lethal blows that take down the first lines of wolves in seconds. Maintaining absolute composure, the former mercenary takes down yet another of the magical beasts that was trying to surprise him from above under the gray winter sky. Lying in the snow, his mouth agape in shock, Luton stares at the boy's unbelievable performance, admitting he has no idea what kind of ordeal he's faced in all these years of absence. The royal knight reflects with emotion that the imposing man fighting before his eyes is definitely no longer the small, frail companion with the wooden sword from his childhood. Elric continues his devastating advance, unleashing circular slashes of pure blue energy that decimate the entire remaining pack in an instant. His eyes gleam with the extreme coldness of a true veteran warrior who perfectly masters every opening on the battlefield. With one last, magnificent burst of brilliant mana, he finishes the battle, felling all surviving monsters in the snowy clearing of Wibben. Absolute silence reigns once more in the frozen forest as the boy coldly observes the result of his military intervention against the beasts. He elegantly deactivates the brilliant flow of mana from his hand, catching his breath after the physical exertion of the confrontation in the forest. All that immense blue spiritual pressure dissipates gently in the cold air of Wibben beneath the Wibben winter storm. The Portman heir rests the imperial blade on the frozen ground to regain his strength, feeling the weight of his injured leg take its toll on the physical exertion. Luton remains paralyzed with an expression of utter astonishment, unable to process the monstrous strength displayed by the captain. Elric turns slowly with a very serene and friendly expression, playfully asking what his partner thought of that little combat demonstration in the forest. Sporting a very charming and gentle smile, he asks mockingly if that was enough to finally satisfy all his curiosity about her years of absence. The imperial knight simply collapsed back onto the soft snow with a long sigh of exhaustion at his captain's blunt response. He humorously confesses that he now feels even more confused and surprised than before about his friend's past. A little later, back in the safety and warmth of the old wooden cabin, Elric sincerely thanks his friend for protecting his wife in the forest, receiving a humble reply from the knight. With his body properly bandaged by the maids, Luton praises the captain's impeccable posture and emphasizes that the real rescue was carried out solely by him in the blizzard. Elric gives a kind smile and, arms crossed in the room, asks if his friend would be willing to grant him one last, very special business favor. The warrior smiles cheerfully from behind his bandages and assures with complete loyalty that, since his captain saved his life twice, all he has to do is give the order and he will carry it out immediately. Elric then proposes that Luton officially take full credit for the hunt of the blue wolves to avoid drawing unwanted attention to himself, leaving the royal knight completely shocked by the proposal. The young master calmly explains that he has strong personal reasons for maintaining his disguise and insists on the favor, leaving his friend quite hesitant in the room. Luton stared at the ground for a few moments in absolute silence, digesting Elric's request with utmost seriousness in his heart. The following day, Wibben's main square is completely packed with locals joyfully celebrating the arrival of their new official hero. The elder of the local guild shakes the royal knight's hand and enthusiastically praises his heroic courage in single-handedly facing that entire dangerous pack of blue wolves. Sweating nervously at the whole last-minute public charade, Luton tries to stammer a minimally humble response to the residents. In the midst of the noisy crowd, Elric glances at him with a rather knowing smile and makes a discreet gesture for silence with his finger to his lips. The bandaged royal knight swallows hard and looks away, his face flushed, silently agreeing to keep the charade a secret until the end. He breaks into a broad smile and solemnly declares to the crowd that he only wielded his royal sword to ensure the peace of Wibben, drawing more applause and proud shouts from the local elders. The elder raises his arms and loudly proclaims to the entire square to celebrate the presence of the great knight and savior of Wibben at the festival. The entire crowd of peasants erupted in shouts and warm applause under the clear sky of, that cold winter afternoon. Satisfied with the success of his disguise strategy, Elric flashes a friendly smile and murmurs that it's also time to return to his mansion. The story takes us back to the luxurious and imposing official estate of the Portman family, covered in sparkling snow. Elric's carriage travels at a steady speed along the cold roads of the wheat farm under the pleasant afternoon sun. The vehicle's enormous wooden wheels turn rhythmically, crushing the snow-covered path back to the mansion. As Elric carefully exited the vehicle in the main courtyard, he immediately encountered his wife, who was already anxiously waiting for him at the entrance of their home. Tyria displays an extremely sweet and gentle smile as she welcomes her husband, confessing that she had begun to worry quite a bit about his unusual delay. The young master rubs the back of his neck in embarrassment and apologizes affectionately, explaining that he had to attend Luton's preparations and farewell in the square, and that's why he ended up being a little late. The blonde woman gazes thoughtfully at her husband and asks worriedly about the state of his injured leg and the use of his walking stick, and Elric explains gently that the doctor only recommended avoiding unnecessary exertion for a few more days. He takes rhythmic, firm steps without his cane to demonstrate that he feels perfectly healthy, causing his wife to smile with relief under the sun. However, Elric's tone suddenly turns serious as he approaches Tyria in the twilight. He gazes at her with a look full of affection and genuine concern, pleading from the bottom of his heart that she never again risk her life in that dangerous way in the forest. Her face completely red with embarrassment and emotion, the young noblewoman smiles tenderly and sweetly promises to fulfill her lord's wish. Satisfied, Elric gently suggests that they go inside the mansion at once to escape the harsh winter cold, and the two walk side by side towards the main hall, arm in arm. The young man firmly gripped the golden doorknob and opened the large glass doors of Wibben's mansion. With a gentle smile and flushed cheeks, he politely gives way and affectionately asks his wife to go in first. Rhonda and little Marie watch the romantic scene from afar with amused laughter, gossiping as if commenting that the couple's chemistry seems as warm as summer even in the middle of winter. Tyria expresses her deepest gratitude for her husband's kindness, feeling her heart warm with pure happiness at every step they take together. But walking slowly down the corridor, the young noblewoman completely loses her balance and collapses unconscious due to exhaustion and the cold from the confrontation, leaving Elric in complete shock. The young man hurriedly cradles her in his arms at the last second of sheer desperation, frantically begging his beloved wife to open her eyes and wake from her sudden fainting spell. It all begins in a worrying way when Tyria, completely pale and weak, is hurriedly helped by Rhonda inside the carriage that rattles along the road. The doctor examines the situation and seriously informs Elric that his wife's condition is far worse than he had imagined. Elric is completely shocked and speechless upon hearing that she may be about to reach a point of no return. The doctor looks at him sadly and comments that the late Hovan Portman had exactly that same look of despair on his face when he went through something similar. Desperate at the seriousness of the situation, the young man grabs the doctor's shoulder with extreme force. Elric screams at the doctor to do absolutely everything possible to save her, confessing that she is the most precious person in his life. The doctor bows respectfully and solemnly promises that he will do his best to help in the young woman's recovery. The carriage speeds off, cutting through the cold, snow-covered landscape in search of urgent medical help. Elric lets out a long sigh of anguish as he arrives before the imposing Portman mansion until someone suddenly calls him. The boy collapses to his knees on the frozen floor, exhausted both physically and mentally, while the maids rush desperately towards him. Rhonda and Marie quickly try to comfort him, asking the young master to try to remain calm amidst all the panic. Later, silence fills the dining room as Elric remains seated alone at the table, enjoying his meal. He stares at the untouched plate of food with a completely blank and distant look. The young man fondly remembers when Tyria used to sit right there in front of him and sweetly ask if he was enjoying the meal. In his memory, she displayed an extremely warm and gentle smile that warmed his heart. He recalls how guilty he felt that they hardly spoke in their daily lives because of his very reserved nature. The young man bitterly regrets not having had the courage to ask to speak with her for just a few more minutes during those mornings. Back in the present reality, the plate of eggs and toast remains untouched before his eyes. Marie and Rhonda watch him with deep concern, noticing that the young master hasn't even touched the meal that was served. Annoyed by his obvious lack of appetite, Rhonda hurriedly leaves to find a solution, while Marie gazes at him sadly. The young maid removes the tray of cold food from the table with a dejected sigh. Marie becomes thoughtful and quite worried, remembering that under normal circumstances, the boy would devour the entire feast in a few moments. Rhonda approaches him affectionately and insists that he eat something, but Elric quietly apologizes, confessing that he has completely lost his appetite. To try and distract him from his melancholy, the housekeeper mentions the beautiful garden that Tyria used to frequent and suggests they take a quick walk there. The two arrive at a stunning and vast field filled with beautiful blue roses shimmering under the winter sun. Elric asks in surprise if that is indeed his wife's garden, and Rhonda proudly confirms that she has cared for those flowers with immense affection since before the young man's return. The housekeeper explains that those roses are able to bloom even in the harsh winter thanks to the use of magical engineering and Tyria's extreme dedication. She recalls with amusement that the young master also loved plants very much when he was a child, but he looks away, commenting that those are just distant memories from his past. Walking among the blue flowers, Elric admits to himself that the scent of the plants isn't what truly occupies his weary mind these past few days. Sadly, he is still haunted by the terrible smell of the battlefields and the tragic sight of lifeless bodies he accumulated during his war years. Rhonda comments with admiration on Tyria's nobility, revealing that she heard the young noblewoman had a great dream of becoming a combat medic on the battlefields. The boy stopped in his tracks, surprised, trying to process the fact that such a delicate girl wanted to act amidst so much violence. The revelation brings back an old memory of when a small hand reached out a bandage to help him in the Wibbin forest. Seeing the boy cover his eyes in emotion, Rhonda asks worriedly if he's all right, and he replies that he just remembered something important he had forgotten. Noticing the chilly breeze beginning to blow, the housekeeper suggests they return to the mansion, and the young man readily agrees. The beautiful orange sunset begins to tint the sky above the grand Portman mansion. Inside the office, a surprised voice calls out to the young master upon noticing his presence at the door. Elric enters the room somewhat confused and questions the butler Aldio about why he is working in Tyria's private office. Aldio gestures toward the desk piled high with reports and explains that he is reviewing all the paperwork, recalling that he learned to manage these matters while serving the former patriarch. The young man becomes furious and rages that the butler should have helped Tyria with this administrative burden much sooner, since she clearly fainted from working alone. With great etiquette and respect, the old butler clarifies that he was merely following express orders from his mistress not to interfere in her business dealings. Elric swallows his anger and asks somewhat awkwardly if there's any way he can help with the task, but Aldio politely declines, insisting on focusing on the documents alone for now. Sighing, the young man accepts the answer and says he will ask Rhonda to bring him some hot tea to comfort him before leaving the room. Meanwhile, the young maid Marie hurries down the imposing hallway, pushing the metal tea cart. She gently knocks on Elric's door and informs him that she has prepared the drink, receiving permission from the young master to enter the chambers. Marie enters the silent room and stares at the young man who remained seated on the divan with an extremely melancholic and pensive expression. The awkward silence that falls over the room makes the little maid quite nervous as she holds the tray. She begins to carefully pour the hot drink, filling the delicate porcelain cup under the watchful eyes of the master. Trying to bring some joy to the young man, Marie smiles broadly and reveals that she had prepared the very rose tea that Tyria loved so much. Elric stares intently at the steaming cup before him, his expression deeply focused, feeling memories of his wife flood his heart intensely. Marie tries to calm Elric's troubled heart, imploring the young master not to despair, as she is certain his wife will soon recover. Trying to hide his own distress, the boy lets out an awkward laugh and apologizes for making her worry unnecessarily about his feelings. The maid bows deeply and assures him that there is no problem at all, shyly admitting that she was only startled to see him look so downcast. She politely bids farewell to her master and closes the large wooden door as she leaves the silent room. Alone in his room, Elric stares thoughtfully at his untouched teacup and lets out a long sigh as he remembers with deep concern his young wife. Looking out the window under the beautiful starry night sky, the young man wholeheartedly hopes that his beloved will recover from her illness as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the soft light from a single window remains lit in the middle of the freezing night in the mansion's medical wing. Lying in bed with a high fever, Tyria breathes with extreme difficulty while the nurse jots down the information on her clipboard with a worried expression. The young noblewoman slowly opens her eyes and thinks with anguish that she cannot simply continue lying there, doing nothing while everyone suffers because of her. A tear rolls softly down her hot face as she tortures herself, thinking that her husband will become ill with worry over her. Noticing the slight movement in the bed, the caregiver leans over carefully and anxiously asks if her young employer has finally woken up. But the fever quickly consumes Tyria again, causing the nurse to desperately call out her mistress's name as she sees her lose consciousness in bed.